The sanctuary was supposed to be absolute, an island forged by a mother's desperate, suffocating love, a place where even the wind moved with caution, and where solitude was a currency earned through decades of isolation. Persephone lived in a paradise of stillness, until the rhythm of her world was shattered by a sound that did not belong in the garden. Clink, clink. The metallic rattle of a divine artifact hitting the stone was the death knell of her innocence. Before she could even draw breath to scream, the air itself seemed to harden. Her senses were stolen in a heartbeat. A hand, calloused and impossibly firm, clamped over her mouth, stifling the panic rising in her throat. Then the world went black. A blindfold, thick and suffocating, erased the horizon. The goddess of spring, now reduced to a captive in her own sanctuary, struggled against a strength that felt like tectonic plates shifting against her frame. Her mother's warnings, once dismissed as the ramblings of a paranoid deity, suddenly echoed with chilling clarity. The warnings about the world beyond the mist, the tales of gods who took what they desired without apology. It turns out, you do not need to go to the world for the world to come for you. A hand tangled into her hair, forcing her head back with a cruel, possessive grace. She felt the ghost of teeth grazing the sensitive skin of her neck, a predatory marking that sent a violent tremor through her spine. Her body betrayed her, stiffening not just with terror, but with a sudden, electric recognition. The silhouette behind her pulled her close, his chest a wall of ice and iron pressed against her back. The fabric of her robe was discarded with a careless, sharp motion, leaving her skin exposed to the sudden, biting chill of the evening air. She was no longer just a daughter in hiding. She was a prize being claimed. Then he whispered. The voice was a velvet blade, smooth and deeply familiar. It carried the scent of ancient earth and the hollow silence of the grave. He spoke her name, savoring the syllables as if they were a long-awaited meal. He mocked her earlier bravado, his tongue tracing the line of her throat with a chilling, calculated intimacy. She had spent her life believing she was the safest creature in existence, tucked away from the prying eyes of the pantheon. But the darkness pressing against her was not a stranger. It was a shadow that had been stalking her across the periphery of her dreams. The realization hit her harder than the physical restraint. This was not a random abduction. It was a hunt that had finally reached its conclusion. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Fear curled in her stomach, heavy and cold, yet beneath it a strange, forbidden curiosity stirred. The mask had fallen, and for the first time, she understood the true cost of being found. He was here, and if he had breached the impenetrable, what could possibly stop him from keeping her? The air in the garden had shifted. It was no longer the sweet, cloying scent of perpetual spring. It was thick with the copper tang of ozone and the heavy, suffocating musk of the abyss. Persephone found herself pinned, her senses overwhelmed by a presence that felt like the literal weight of death pressing against her soul. Every movement he made was a calculated unraveling of her carefully constructed reality. The friction against her skin was abrasive, an invasive reclamation that defied the sanctuary she had known for an eternity. There was no gentle courtship here, only the raw, rhythmic insistence of a king who had finally come to collect a debt he felt was long overdue. He whispered into the hollow of her neck, his voice a gravelly tremor that seemed to vibrate through her very marrow. Every word he uttered was a needle of truth, mocking the delicate, gilded cage she had called a home. He asked about her joy, about the thrill of playing a part, and with every thrust, the barrier between her sheltered upbringing and the dark, visceral truth of the cosmos shattered. She sobbed a name that had been forbidden in her mother's halls. Hades. The lord of the underworld was not merely a myth she had heard whispered by the wind. He was the crushing reality of her bloodline, the shadow she had been trying to outrun since the moment of her creation. Beneath them, the fields of flowers she had once tended with such innocent devotion were being crushed into the earth, trampled by the gravity of their union. It was a violent, desperate symphony of bodies, a collision of celestial forces that left her trembling in the wreckage of her own identity. Why had she been hidden so deeply for so long? Her mother, Demeter, had painted the world outside as a festering wound of war and treachery, a place where the gods acted out their appetites with careless cruelty. She had woven a tapestry of protection that looked suspiciously like a shroud. Demeter loved her, yes, but it was the possessive, frantic love of a gardener protecting a rare bloom from being plucked by a rival. Persephone had been told she was a treasure, but in the quiet, agonizing moments when she was alone with her thoughts, she knew the truth. She was a secret, a living, breathing evidence of a sin her mother could never reconcile. Born of forced divinity, she was a child of chaos wrapped in the silk of overbearing maternal obsession. The island was a paradise that functioned as a tomb, where her only companions were the echoes of her own restlessness and the suffocating promise that her mother would watch over her until the end of time. A promise that felt more like a sentence. She had begged for freedom, only to be met with the cold, damp walls of her mother's anxiety. She had been forced to swear oaths by the river Styx, to bind her soul to a woman whose love felt more like a tethering. And now the tether had snapped. The darkness of his carriage had ascended to the surface, and the boundary between the world of light and the realm of silence had been breached. She lay there, shivering, caught in the wreckage of a life built on lies, realizing that the monster her mother warned her about was not the one she should have feared the most. The night was no longer just a time of rest, it was a destination. And as the last of her resistance crumbled under his touch, she had to wonder, if the world outside was as cruel as her mother claimed, then why, in the heart of this terrifying darkness, did it feel like she was finally waking up? The island had become a gilded cage, its beauty a mockery of the stagnation festering within its borders. To Persephone, every sunrise felt like a renewed sentence, a slow erosion of her spirit that mirrored the myth of the Titan chained to the crags, enduring an eternity of suffering. Her mother's love, once a warm blanket, had transformed into a suffocating shroud, keeping her tethered to a paradise where time refused to move and life lacked the sting of reality. She had begun to haunt the island like a ghost of her own making. It was during a night of impenetrable, velvety blackness that she found the fissure. It was a secret tucked into the belly of the earth, a passage that felt as ancient as the soil itself. Guided by the flickering, erratic pulse of a firefly, she ventured into the dark until the cave wall offered up a gateway. It was a threshold that did not belong, a silent invitation to abandon the light. She did not hesitate. Pushing through, she stepped out of her mother's garden and into a world of eternal, biting twilight. The air here was not the sweet scent of blooming narcissus. It was thick with the gray, clinging dampness of the river Acheron, a place where the sun was a forgotten dream. Persephone pulled her cloak tight, a futile gesture against a cold that seeped past her skin and settled deep into her bones. She stood in the mist, a living flame amidst a sea of cooling embers. A line of souls stretched toward the dock, their faces etched with the monotonous grief of the departed. They muttered to one another, a cacophony of petty grievances and earthbound regrets. Their voices were hollow, stripped of the vibrant urgency of the living. To them, the tragedy of death was reduced to the lack of a coin for the crossing. They stood in the gray expanse, unaware that they were now nothing more than memories, casting no shadows against the pallor of the afterlife. Persephone approached the water's edge, keeping her head bowed, a splash of color in a monochrome procession. She reached the boatman, a skeletal, weary figure whose eyes had seen too many ends to care for the beginnings of another. The interaction was a familiar, stinging ritual. The oar, a blunt instrument of denial, blocked her path. The demand for the coin was sharp, a rhythmic repetition of a toll she could not pay. He looked at her with the exhausted apathy of a bureaucrat of the damned, shooing her away for the fourth time. He did not care for her lineage or her curiosity. To him, she was simply a nuisance who refused to accept the finality of the river. She backed away, her fists white-knuckled against her sides, watching the boat slip into the fog with its cargo of lost souls. The fleeting nature of her presence gnawed at her. She was a visitor with an expiration date, tethered to the whims of the lunar cycle and the retreating shadows. When the goddess Hecate withdrew her influence, the underworld would reject her, pulling her back to the surface just as the light of the sun began its relentless, mocking return. She stood at the riverbank, the mist swirling around her ankles, a phantom trying to grasp the shadow of a king. She had come for him. She had come for the ruler of this silent, silver kingdom, the one whose name she dared not speak under the watchful eyes of her mother. The underworld was vast, a labyrinth of secrets waiting to be unearthed, yet here she was, trapped on the threshold, forced to wait for the next dance with darkness. Her eyes scanned the horizon of the dead, searching for a sign, a shift in the gloom, anything to suggest that the master of this realm was aware of his persistent, unwanted guest. The dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky, a pale, sickly light that signaled her eviction. Her time was running out, the walls of the world closing in, and the desperate yearning for the man who ruled the silence burned brighter than ever. If she could not cross the river, she would have to find another way to make the king of the dead take notice. And as the mist began to thin, she realized with a jolt of chilling clarity that the river was not the only thing that could bridge the gap between their worlds. She just needed to find the courage to jump. The underworld was not merely a graveyard. It was a vault of impossible legends. Tales whispered of an endless expanse, a land where the surface's sunlight was replaced by the silent, crushing glitter of hoarded history. They spoke of a golden palace that made the marble halls of Olympus look like mere playthings, a repository of every lost treasure, every stolen secret, and every fortune that had ever slipped through the fingers of the living. Persephone craved the sight of it. Not for the gold, nor for the piles of jewels that sat like mountains of frozen starlight, but for the relic that rendered its wearer a ghost among the living. The helm of invisibility, a shroud that even the most watchful eyes in the cosmos could not pierce. To possess it was to possess true freedom. But at the riverbank, the gatekeeper remained a wall of rot and obstinance. Karen was a creature of singular purpose, a bureaucrat of the void who demanded currency she did not possess. To him, she was just another interloper, a smudge of vitality on a landscape meant only for the hollow. The air grew heavy, static-charged with a sudden, oppressive authority. The mist parted, forced aside not by the wind, but by a presence that demanded space. The king had arrived. He did not need to pay the toll. He was the toll. As he stepped onto the cowhide boat, the atmosphere shifted from cold indifference to a razor-sharp tension. The restless souls around them, those thin echoes of humanity, sensed the change. They hissed, their voices like dry leaves skittering over stone, mocking the girl who dared to stand on the edge of a world that wanted her gone. The boatman gestured toward her, his voice a jagged rasp of agitation, calling for her removal. And then the king turned. It was not a glance. It was an extraction of breath. His eyes, two pools of absolute, depthless gray, locked onto hers. In that gaze, Persephone saw the reflection of a dark moon, a void that was not cold, but hypnotic, pulling at the very seams of her resolve. The noise of the dead faded into a muffled hum, replaced by the thundering of her own blood. His voice did not strike her ears. It resonated directly within the chamber of her mind. A question, cool and mocking, sliced through the distance between them. "Are you lost, little girl?" The audacity of the inquiry should have sparked her fear, but instead, it ignited a reckless, burning hunger. She threw the question back, her own voice a prayer whispered into the abyss. She demanded he remember her, demanded he acknowledge the fracture she had caused in his kingdom of shadows. But the boat did not turn back. The vessel pulled away, cutting through the black waters, carrying the ruler of the dead into the impenetrable haze, leaving her standing on the shore with nothing but the echo of his presence vibrating in her marrow. She was left behind, but the judgment she once held, the caution her mother had drilled into her heart, had been incinerated. The terror of death had been replaced by a terrifying, magnetic longing. She didn't just want to see his kingdom anymore. She wanted to stand in the center of his shadow. Persephone realized then that she was no longer merely a daughter in hiding. She was a moth circling a flame that could consume her. As the mist began to swallow the dock, she clutched her own arms, her heart repeating his name like a frantic, desperate rhythm. She had found her key to the world, but it was buried deep within the dark, and the door was already locking from the inside. She needed to reach him, no matter what it cost, because for the first time in her life, the stillness of her paradise felt like an ending, and he, the Lord of the Dead, was the only thing that felt like a beginning. The realm of the dead is a place of monotonous gray, a silence so profound it becomes a physical weight. Hermes, ever the nimble traveler, found the atmosphere of the underworld grating, his celestial instincts recoiling from the discordant howls of trapped titans and the suffocating pressure of an empire built on finality. Even the king of this domain, Hades, found himself restless. When the fog rolled thick and heavy off the Acheron, obscuring the boundaries of his realm, he sought the outskirts, where the barrier between order and the chaotic madness of the abyss grew thin. At the dock, the ferryman was in a foul mood, his eyes darting toward the mist with a mix of irritation and dread. He complained of the girl, the one with eyes like sun-drenched wheat, the persistent shadow who haunted the shoreline. She was a living, breathing defiance of the natural order, a splash of vibrant, terrifying vitality in a place that demanded only cold, pale absence. Hades listened, his gaze unmoving. He did not need to ask for a description. He remembered her. He remembered the precise curve of her jaw, the way her breath caught in a soft, visible puff of warmth, and the way her cloak failed to hide the stubborn, electric pulse of a life that had no business being here. She was a goddess of spring trapped in a winter that had no end. To him, she was a puzzle carved from porcelain and longing.
Why did she stay?
The dead despised her, their hollow hearts curdling with a resentment born of their own finished stories. They saw a trespasser, a vanity that mocked their stillness. But Hades saw something else, a hunger that matched his own. He left the boat, leaving the bickering ferryman and the nervous messenger god behind. He moved through the jagged, suffocating forest of the underworld, as if he were walking through his own garden. He felt a strange, rhythmic pull, a sensation like a nail driven into his resolve, anchoring him to her location. It was not mere beauty that drew him, it was the raw, unpolished intensity of her gaze. He found her nestled among the weeds of the shadow forest, a small, dark-haired figure huddled against the gloom. She looked small, vulnerable, yet there was a defiant rigidity in her posture, the pride of one who had been kept in a box but never truly broken. Hades stepped into her line of sight, his presence darkening the space around her. The air grew heavy, charged with the sudden proximity of two opposing forces. He watched her startle, her gaze snapping upward to meet his. When she whispered his name, the sound was an anomaly in the silence, a soft, melodic intrusion that sent a jolt through his senses. For a man who had spent an eternity surrounded by the cessation of all things, the sudden, brilliant brightness of her confusion was intoxicating. He had spent his existence overseeing the end of stories, yet here, in the glorious, suffocating darkness, he found himself standing at the beginning of something dangerous. He looked down at her, his expression a mask of cool curiosity, masking a sudden, violent realization. The hunt was over, but the game had only just begun, and for the first time in an age, the king of the dead felt the unfamiliar, prickling heat of desire. The fog of the underworld did not just obscure vision, it warped time, pulling the threads of reality until the girl huddled in the undergrowth seemed both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. Hades watched her, his gaze tracing the frantic, nervous energy radiating from her slender frame. She was a fever dream in a realm of frost, vibrant, warm, and entirely out of place. He moved with the deliberate grace of a predator who had forgotten the taste of prey. As he pulled back his hood, the shadows clinging to his features retreated, revealing eyes the color of rain-slicked slate and a face that had not known the touch of genuine surprise in centuries. He mocked her, a low, gravelly vibration that teased the edges of her fear, asking if she intended to flee once more. She did not run. Instead, she trembled, a physical manifestation of the cold seeping from the black earth into her marrow. Her lips, once soft and pink, were now tinged with the cerulean hue of the abyss. He probed at her presence, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet. Why a goddess of the light would risk the ferryman's ire, why she would haunt the periphery of his domain like a specter of her own making. He wanted the truth, even if the truth felt like a wildfire in his gut. Then, she broke the silence. The confession was not a scream, it was a surrender. She did not just stand, she moved. A blur of motion, a sudden, desperate warmth colliding with his cold, unyielding form. Her arms wrapped around him, anchoring herself to his torso, her grip defying the logic of the afterlife. She was small, yes, her head barely reaching his shoulder, but the strength in her hold was born of a singular, iron-willed obsession.
I was looking for you.
The admission hung in the stale, stagnant air, heavier than the weight of 1,000 souls. Hades froze. His world, usually governed by the precise mechanics of death and the stillness of the grave, stuttered. For a man who ruled over endings, this felt suspiciously like a beginning. A laugh, rusty and unused, escaped him, a sound that startled the very shadows of the forest. He looked down at the crown of her head, feeling the frantic, erratic drumbeat of her heart against his own chest. She was a creature of reckless honesty, a girl who refused to be terrified of the dark. To him, she was a paradox. She was free in a way he had never been, unburdened by the ancient, heavy duty of his crown. He remained paralyzed, his arms trapped at his sides, held hostage by the audacity of her affection. He should have cast her back to the surface. He should have left her to the mercy of the ferryman. But as he looked into her wide, expectant eyes that held a brightness that could only be called dangerous, he knew he was already lost. He had spent eternity managing the departure of others. He had no idea how to handle someone who was so violently, stubbornly intent on staying. And as the dark forest seemed to lean in, waiting for his response, he realized the trouble had only just begun, and he didn't want it to end. The underworld held its breath, suspended in a silence that felt heavier than the weight of the mountains above. Hades, a sovereign of shadows and finality, found himself unmoored by the small, persistent warmth clinging to his mantle. He tried to summon the cold, dismissive detachment that defined his rule, yet every word she offered felt like a splinter of light piercing the eternal dusk. He questioned her, a stern, reflexive defense against the intrusion, demanding to know what she hoped to gain from this dangerous pilgrimage. Her reply was disarmingly simple, a blade of truth that carved through his cynicism. She had no grand design, no hidden agenda, only a relentless, inexplicable pull toward his presence. She clung to his himation, her small hands gripping the fabric with a desperate, childlike intensity, as if he were the only solid anchor in a shifting, spectral maze. Her steps, light and unburdened by the dread that crippled the dead, trailed him through the gloom. It was an absurdity, a daughter of the sun wandering the domain of the afterlife with the wide-eyed curiosity of a tourist in a graveyard. He walked, and she followed, her voice a fragile melody against the distant, jagged whistling of the wind. She spoke of her fascination, of the strange beauty she found in the dark, and her refusal to fear the very place where all stories were meant to conclude. When she questioned his own morality, turning the mirror of logic upon the Lord of the Underworld himself, asking why the place of justice should be more terrifying than the world of the cruel, Hades found himself silenced. His laughter, a rare and rusty sound, echoed against the canyon walls. It was not the derision he had intended, but a genuine, startled appreciation. She was naive, yes, but there was a sharp, unyielding wisdom in her defiance. She did not understand the gravity of her own request. She did not comprehend that the river Acheron was not a portal, but a threshold from which there was no casual return. He looked down at her, seeing the slight, embarrassed flush of her skin, the way she worried her earlobes under his scrutiny. He saw a creature of light attempting to embrace the dark, unaware that once the dark embraced back, it would never willingly let go. He had warned her. He had outlined the permanence of the crossing, the way the gates of his domain slammed shut behind those who dared to step into his sanctuary. Yet, she looked at him with an affection that felt like a quiet, terrifying threat to the order of his existence. He stood there, the king of the dead, feeling an uncharacteristic sympathy for a girl whose heartbeat was the loudest sound in his kingdom. He realized then that he was no longer just guiding a wanderer. He was being charmed by a disaster. And as the mist swirled tighter around them, sealing them into their own private pocket of time, he knew that the curiosity he felt was no longer a question of her fate, but of his own. The path ahead was paved with shadows, and she was walking into them with a smile. Hades watched her, a dark, unsettling humor rising in his chest, because he knew that once she crossed that river, she would become his forever, and for the first time, the idea did not fill him with the cold peace of death, but with the burning, unpredictable heat of life. The terrain shifted as they ventured deeper, the suffocating dampness of the riverbank giving way to a jagged, volcanic landscape. Ahead, the Phlegethon churned, a river not of water, but of molten fury, bleeding heat into the stagnant air. Persephone felt the change instantly, the warmth prompting her to loosen the heavy folds of her cloak, her eyes wide with a dangerous, untempered fascination. Hades led the way, his stride measured and his senses hypervigilant. Every step he took was a calculated risk. He watched her with a mixture of skepticism and a burgeoning, reluctant pull he could not define. To him, she remained an enigma, a creature of soft edges and bright, impulsive honesty navigating a world forged in iron and ancient trauma. He was a king born of betrayal, cast into the silence of the earth while his brothers basked in the golden light of Olympus. He had spent eons draped in the invisibility he had fought for, a phantom ruler of a realm of ends. The irony was not lost on him. The girls sought his company as if he were a beacon, when for everyone else, he was the very shadow they spent their lives trying to escape. "You have been loved, haven't you?" Hades remarked, his voice devoid of accusation but thick with a residue of old, cold envy. It was a statement that carried the weight of an eternity spent in solitude. Persephone stopped, the distance between them feeling less like physical space and more like a chasm of experience. She reached out, her fingers hovering near his arm, a silent request for a connection he wasn't sure how to grant. When he turned away to negotiate the treacherous rocks, her expression flickered with a brief, piercing disappointment before she followed, her persistence a stubborn, rhythmic pulse. When the fog grew dense, he reached back to offer his hand, but caught himself, pulling away just as she ascended to his level. The air between them hummed with the heat of his own confusion. She didn't seem to notice his hesitation. Instead, she closed the gap, her hand finding the crook of his arm. He did not pull away. The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy with the dangerous, unspoken possibility of an alliance. At the precipice of a cliff, she faltered. Below, the abyss was a sea of shifting white mist, a void that threatened to swallow the senses whole. Hades steadied her, his grip on her shoulder firm, anchoring her against the vertigo of the afterlife. She was trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer, overwhelming reality of a world she had only ever heard of in sanitized whispers. She pointed toward a distant, flickering bloom amidst the gray, a flower sprouting from the fire of asphodelos. Hades explained the architecture of the damned, describing the blue smoke that billowed from the mountain's peak. It was the breath of the trapped, the agony of the ancient smiths, the Cyclopes, laboring in the dark to sustain the gods who had forgotten them. She listened, her eyes reflecting the blue light of the volcanic vents. When she asked about his helmet, about the sensation of vanishing from the world, her voice lost its nervous tremor and surged with a genuine, infectious excitement. She didn't recoil at the mention of the monsters in the dark. She leaned in, drawn to the carnage and the creation stories alike. Hades looked at her, this girl who feared neither the dead nor the monsters of Tartarus, and felt the foundations of his isolation begin to crack. She wanted to see the smiths. She wanted to descend into the very belly of the world. He realized then that she was not just curious, she was a catalyst. By promising her the sight of the unseen, he was binding her to his side, leading her deeper into the labyrinth of his own history. The cliff's edge was steep, the shadows below were ravenous, and as he nodded toward the path into the deep, he knew he was inviting the one thing he had never dared to contemplate, the possibility that he was no longer alone. The abyss was not merely a void, it was a hungry, echoing throat. Hades spoke of Tartarus, with the jaded detachment of a warden describing a prison cell, his voice carrying the cynicism of an exile. He had long ago severed his ties to the sun-drenched arrogance of Olympus, finding a strange, grim peace in the cold reality of his realm. To him, the gods above were a headache he had successfully cured by putting a world between them. Persephone listened, the weight of her secret pressing against her ribs like a physical stone. She was a daughter of the very architects of his misery, a child of Zeus and Demeter, and every word he spoke against his kin felt like a silent condemnation. She navigated the conversation with the clumsy grace of a novice liar, crafting a facade that felt brittle enough to shatter. When he asked for her name, the truth hung on the edge of her tongue, but she swallowed it, replacing her identity with a stolen one. Neosis, a ripple on the water, a river nymph. It was a flimsy, paper-thin shield, and she knew it. The moment the name left her lips, she felt the frantic, panicked urge to correct it, to reclaim herself.
Kore.
The name slipped out, a desperate plea for recognition. Hades paused, his eyes narrowing as he tested the word. Virgin. A label of purity that sounded almost ironic in the damp, decaying air of his domain. He looked at her then, not as a nuisance, but as a curiosity, a girl whose soul seemed too bright for the shadows she chased. The ground groaned. A low, tectonic shudder rippled through the rocks, carrying the distorted, bestial roars of the entities trapped in the deep. The underworld was waking, restless and agitated, and Hades sensed the impending shift of the cosmic clock. The dawn was coming, and with it, the relentless, piercing gaze of the sun god. He turned to her, his expression hardening. The time for games had evaporated. He ordered her to leave, his command absolute, yet she stood her ground with a defiance that left him baffled. She promised to wait. She promised to return. He approached her, a predatory shadow moving to fix the disarray of her cloak. His hands were calloused, smelling of stone and ancient earth, and as he carefully adjusted the knots at her throat, the proximity turned the air between them into a static charge. She couldn't breathe. His touch was clinical, yet it felt like a brand, a lingering heat that burned through the fabric to the skin beneath. He spoke of the nature of his domain, that death was not the end, but a transition, a force that stripped away everything one held dear. He warned her that she was too innocent for the abyss, that she belonged to the sky and the light. It was a dismissal, a final shove toward the path home. But as he turned to leave, she delivered the final blow, a comparison that stopped him dead in his tracks.
Father.
The absurdity of it, the jarring inaccuracy, left the lord of the underworld momentarily stunned. He looked back at her, his composure fractured, only to find her eyes tracking him with a relentless, terrifying devotion. She did not listen. She did not retreat. As he walked away, disappearing into the jagged labyrinth of the underworld, Persephone stayed rooted to the spot. Her fingers touched the nape of her neck, where his shadow had lingered like a ghost. She was left alone in the encroaching gray, a girl with a false name and a stolen heart, waiting for a king who didn't know he had already been claimed. The path back to her mother's garden was open, but as she watched his retreating form, she knew she had already stepped off the edge of the world. The golden palace of the underworld was a gilded cage, a monument to silence where the only thing shifting was the cold, hollow weight of eternity. Hades retreated into its depths, his mind a battlefield of fractured peace. His recent journey to the surface, an audience with Zeus, had been nothing more than a theater of the absurd, a tedious dance of divine ego and political rot. He had turned his back on the sun, on the petty dramas of his kin, only to find the quiet of his own domain stained by an intrusive, persistent thought. She was the phantom in the fog, the girl who defied the gravity of the afterlife. Every update from the boatman, Karen, served as a rhythmic reminder of his own unraveling. The ferryman's reports were laced with annoyance, detailing her endless, aimless vigils by the river. To the souls of the departed, she was an anomaly, a breach in the architecture of their gray reality. To Hades, she was becoming something far more dangerous, a fixation. He told himself she was merely an underripe fruit, a temptation that would bring nothing but the sour taste of regret. Yet, he found his feet moving toward the threshold of his realm before he had even granted himself permission. The night air of the underworld was sharp, laced with the frantic, discordant energy of the trapped titans. The darkness felt thick, pulsating with a strange contagion that seemed to radiate from her presence alone. He reached the docks, and there she was. She looked worse for the wear, her lips pale and chapped from the biting cold of the riverbank, her expression a fragile armor of defiance. She did not welcome him with the grace of a goddess, but with the raw, wounded accusation of someone who had been waiting in the dark for far too long. She did not wait for a greeting. She moved with a singular, stubborn intent, closing the distance between them until her cold, shivering body was pressed against his mantle. She was an anchor made of ice and longing, and for a moment, Hades felt the steady, rhythmic drumbeat of his own resolve falter. The irony was suffocating. His domain was the destination for those seeking to leave the world behind, yet here was a girl doing everything in her power to ensure she never left his side. He questioned her motives, his voice a gravelly echo of his own internal resistance, but she answered with the terrifying simplicity of the absolute. She wasn't playing a game. She was laying claim. He held her, his hands coming to rest on her back with a hesitation that spoke of centuries of distance. Her skin was a shock of cold against his, a reminder that she was ephemeral, fragile, and utterly destined for the light he had abandoned. She whispered of waiting, of closing the gap between them, of building a bridge across the abyss one persistent visit at a time. Hades looked down at her, seeing the smudge of exhaustion under her eyes and the unwavering flame of her conviction. He was the king of the dead, the architect of endings, yet he found himself trapped in the beginning of a disaster he no longer wished to prevent. He could have pushed her away. He could have banned her from his river, sealed the fissure in the rocks, and returned to the perfect, sterile cold of his throne. Instead, he pulled her closer, his heart betraying the lie that he was untouchable. She was a drop of poison in his otherwise stagnant peace, a beautiful, devastating toxin he was already beginning to crave. And as the mist wrapped around them, hiding them from the sight of both the living and the dead, Hades realized with a jolt of dark, self-mocking humor that he was not protecting his realm from her. He was protecting her from the moment he would finally decide to stop letting her go. The air on the banks of the Acheron had grown heavy, charged with a tension that was not the sterile dread of the grave, but something infinitely more volatile. Hades stood rigid, the girl's hands still imprinted on the cold fabric of his mantle. Her admission, that she sought in him the phantom of a father she had never known, felt like an insult to the hunger currently gnawing at his own restraint. He looked at her, searching for the child he wanted to see, but found only a woman waiting to be claimed. She was a dangerous confusion of innocence and intent. She looked for a sanctuary in his arms, failing to realize that the abyss does not offer comfort. It offers only possession. Her persistence was a slow poison, working its way through the ironclad defenses he had spent eons erecting. To her, he was a hearth in the cold. To him, she was a fever he was rapidly losing the will to break. He leaned into her space, his movements predatory yet agonizingly slow. The mist seemed to recede, leaving them isolated in a pocket of profound, breathless silence. "You think a father would look at you with this hunger?" The question was a velvet-wrapped threat. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip, feeling the frantic, erratic pulse of her skin against his fingertips. She froze, the air vanishing from her lungs as his shadow engulfed her completely. Her eyes, those vivid, sun-drenched embers, widened as he bridged the final, agonizing inch. The kiss was not an act of paternal affection. It was a declaration of war against the lines she had tried to draw. His lips were cold, tasting of ancient stone and the metallic tang of the void, but the sensation that flooded her was a searing, electric shock. It was her first taste of the world beyond her cage, and it was devastating. She was shattered, rendered breathless by the sheer, unyielding force of his curiosity. When he pulled back, the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged rhythm of their shared breathing. He caught the tip of her lip between his teeth, a playful, terrifying tease that made her entire frame tremble. He was a creature of the dark, and she was a creature of the sun, and the collision was already beginning to singe the edges of her reality. "This is your last warning," he whispered, his voice a jagged promise against her skin. He knew she was naive, a moth convinced that the flame was merely a light to guide her home. But as he looked at her, trembling and wide-eyed, he knew he had lied. He had no intention of letting her go. He was the king of the dead, and he had just tasted the vitality he had been starving for since the dawn of time. The path back to her mother's garden was fading, the fog closing in like iron bars. He had told her to run, but he had kissed her with the weight of a man who intended to drag her into the deepest parts of his kingdom. The warning had been issued, but the trap had already snapped shut. The kiss had been a fracture in the foundation of the underworld. Hades had expected the girl to recoil, to shrink back into the safety of her ignorance, but instead, she leaned into the dark, her warmth a searing contradiction to his own cold nature. She possessed a terrifying, unpolished confidence that rendered his warnings obsolete. It was a drop of poison, a single, intoxicating moment that promised to corrupt the purity of his resolve. When she asked if he practiced such intimacy with others, his laughter was sharp, a jagged sound that died in the gloom. He was a creature of singular focus, and she had become the only object worth his attention. The regret was already gathering on the horizon like a storm, yet as he pulled her into the finality of a real kiss, he realized he had long ago ceased to care about the price. The return to the surface was a brutal transition. The sun, a bloated, golden eye, began to peek over the horizon, casting a light that felt predatory against the shadows Persephone carried on her skin. She moved through the garden like a thief, her heart still hammering against her ribs, the memory of his lips a phantom burn she was desperate to hide. She was met not by silence, but by Cyane. The nymph stood in the morning haze, her presence a sharp edge in the soft light of the grove. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming secrets, and Cyane was a creature who saw far more than she was ever meant to. The interrogation was immediate, a series of questions that felt like claws scraping against the armor Persephone had spent the night constructing. The sand on her feet and the lingering scent of the salt-choked river were silent witnesses to her treachery. Cyane's worry was a suffocating, maternal thing, a reminder of the prison she had called home. The nymphs were guardians, yes, but they were also jailers, terrified of the retribution that would rain down upon them if the goddess of the harvest discovered her daughter had been wandering in the kingdom of the dead. Persephone felt the familiar, bitter pull of defiance. She looked at Cyane, once her dearest companion, now a reminder of her captivity, and felt nothing but a cold, distancing resentment. The nymphs were afraid of the wrath of a mother who loved too much. Persephone was afraid only of the day that love would finally consume her. She had been a child of paradise, but paradise was a place where nothing ever happened, where every day was a pale reflection of the one before. Now, she was a carrier of the underworld's contagion. She turned her gaze toward the nymph, her posture stiffening. She knew Cyane's weakness, a stubborn, illogical loyalty that had kept her quiet through countless previous transgressions. Persephone leaned into that bond, weaponizing the nymph's affection to buy her own freedom. She looked at her, her yellow eyes hard and unyielding. The silence between them grew, heavy with the weight of impending betrayal. Persephone didn't just want to keep her secret. She wanted to ensure that when the time came to leave this garden forever, she would have no anchors left to hold her back. The question hung in the humid morning air, a demand disguised as a plea, and as Cyane's face fell, Persephone knew the nymph had already lost. The secret was a fragile, crystalline thing, held together by the frayed threads of a nymph's misplaced loyalty. Cyane's questions were like thorns, tearing at the veil Persephone had drawn over her night. She navigated the interrogation with a sharpness that bordered on cruelty, indifferent to the genuine panic she sparked in the eyes of her former friend. To Persephone, the nymphs were no longer companions. They were simply obstacles in the landscape of her obsession. She retreated to the hollow sanctuary of her room, the door clicking shut like a lock on a vault. Once shielded from the prying eyes of the garden, the facade crumbled. She collapsed onto her bed, a shy, delirious smile claiming her features. She pressed her fingertips to her lips, trying to recapture the phantom pressure of his kiss. It was a memory that defied the cold, rational world of the island, an ache that resonated in the marrow of her bones. He had kissed her, the Lord of the Dead, the architect of the final silence. The absurdity of it, the delicious, terrifying wrongness of his touch, was a drug she was already beginning to crave. She replayed the sensation, the coldness of his lips, the dark, unspoken promises lingering in his breath, and found the daylight world to be utterly, unbearably stale. Her own name, the lie of Neosis, tasted like ash on her tongue, a foolish misstep she regretted with every fiber of her being. She wanted him to know her. She wanted him to know the girl who defied the gods, not the nymph who existed only in the margins of a river. Outside, the voices of the nymphs continued to murmur, a background hum of concern and suspicion that she tuned out with the callousness of a queen. She pulled her blankets over her head, retreating into a darkness of her own making, where the only reality that mattered was the one waiting beneath the earth. How simple it would be, she thought, if the world were swallowed whole. If the light of the sun were extinguished, and she was left with nothing but the shadow of the king. When the island finally drifted into the heavy, rhythmic breathing of sleep, Persephone moved. She was a thief in her own home, slipping through the shadows with the silent urgency of a creature hunted by the dawn. She reached the cliff, her body a silhouette against the pale, indifferent moon. The cave mouth waited, a jagged, toothless maw in the stone. She crawled, uncaring as the sharp, unforgiving rock bit into her knees and tore at her silk robes. She was seeking a crack in the world, a way to bleed through the solid stone of reality. She reached the dead-end wall, her sanctuary of desperation. In the suffocating crampness, she did not pray to the gods of the harvest. She did not beg for mercy. Instead, she picked up a shard of jagged flint and began to carve. Stroke by stroke, she etched her intent into the stone. Every letter was a vow, every scratch a frantic attempt to tether herself to the master of the shadows. Will he come? If he does not, must I cross the river of ghosts myself? The questions were etched alongside her name, a desperate, crooked testament to a hunger that was quickly outpacing her sanity. She traced the letters, the stone cold beneath her touch, and waited. The silence of the cave was heavy, pregnant with the weight of the dark. Somewhere, far beneath the crust of the world, the king of the dead was listening. And the letters were the only bait she had left. The threshold of the underworld had grown unnervingly quiet. For 15 days, the usual procession of the damned had been choked off, leaving the river Acheron to stagnate in a silence so thick it felt like a physical suffocation. Persephone tore through the mist, her lungs burning, her feet finding the familiar, treacherous path to the docks. She was a runaway from paradise, desperate to reclaim the dark. She found the ferryman, Charon, draped over his leather-bound vessel like a corpse awaiting an invitation. He was a creature of singular apathy, untroubled by the global silence that had fallen upon the dead. Persephone approached him, her hand extended, offering a handful of salt-crusted gravel as if it were the ransom for her existence. Charon's rejection was immediate and absolute. He was a creature who understood the weight of a shadow, and he knew that she, a creature of pulsing blood and borrowed time, was a violation of the natural order. The ferryman spat at her persistence, his eyes burning with a sickly, bruised light. He spoke of chaos, of Sisyphus, a king in the land of men who had turned the natural cycle into a mockery, causing the gates of the afterlife to jam. He was a man of excessive cunning, a human who had somehow tricked the very machinery of mortality. To Karen, the world above was unraveling, a slow-motion catastrophe that left him with nothing to do but rot in the damp. Persephone barely grasped the implications. Her focus remained singular, a jagged shard of obsession that ignored the collapse of empires and the whims of kings. She pleaded, she wept, she offered her life to the river. But the ferryman remained a bulkhead of stone. "If I cannot cross," she whispered, her voice trembling with a frantic, dangerous edge, "I will swim. And if the beasts of the deep claim me, it shall be your burden to carry." Karen laughed, a sound like grinding bone, utterly unmoved by the dramatic declaration of a girl who had no idea what lived in the pressure of the black depths. "Look around you, little fool," he rasped, gesturing to the unnatural stillness. "The world is screaming, and you are worried about a boat ride." Persephone opened her mouth to snap back, to demand that he summon the king of the dead, but the air beside her suddenly sharpened. The atmosphere curdled. A presence, sudden and sickeningly smooth, manifested out of the fog. Before she could process the shift in pressure, a cane, an instrument of impossible speed and authority, hooked around her waist. She yelped, the sound dying in her throat as she was jerked back from the edge, caught in the grip of a stranger who had stepped through reality as if it were a curtain. She spun, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and found herself face to face not with the king she sought, but with a traveler whose presence felt like a strike of lightning against the dark. The game had changed, and for the first time, she realized she was not the only one hunting in the shadows. The air at the Acheron docks curdled with the arrival of a new, radiant, and utterly dangerous element. The man who stood before them was draped in the casual arrogance of Olympus, his presence a jarring splash of gold against the eternal gray. His cane, topped with a shifting, two-headed snake that seemed to watch Persephone with its own baleful curiosity, coiled around her waist like a living shackle. This was Hermes, the trickster, the messenger of the high gods. Persephone felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her chilled despite the stagnant warmth of the riverbank. He was the golden boy of the sky, the one who had danced in the periphery of her childhood, kept at a distance by her mother's suffocating vigilance. Now, he stood inches away, his smile a bright, dimpled mask that failed to hide the razor-sharp intellect clicking away behind his eyes. The ferryman, Karen, was in no mood for divine pleasantries. He barked at the god with a bitter, graveyard spite, mocking the inefficiency of the messenger's latest mission. Hermes, meanwhile, seemed to be vibrating with a restless, chaotic energy, his attention shifting from the grumpy boatman to the girl who had no business being in the realm of the dead. Hermes's gaze landed on her, and the atmosphere grew taut. He was a god, and gods were cursed with memories that never faded, a truth that made Persephone's skin crawl. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing in that predatory, curious way that meant the game was afoot. "Do we know each other?" The question was a trap. Persephone's denial was swift, a breathless reflex, but she could see the wheels turning in his head. He knew the resonance of her voice. He knew the rhythm of her presence. She felt like a secret caught in the throat of the underworld, suffocating under the weight of his scrutiny. Karen interrupted, impatient to be rid of them both, his eyes flicking to the gold coin Hermes produced. It was a currency of the living, a stark contrast to the hollow tokens of the damned. As the coin exchanged hands, Persephone watched the interaction with a trance-like intensity. Here was proof of the chasm between them. Hermes moved through the underworld as a visitor with a ticket, while she remained a stowaway, a stain on the ledger of the dead. The reason for the ferryman's stagnation became clear. The world above was rotting. Sisyphus, the king of Corinth, had played a game of cosmic extortion, trading the secrets of Zeus for a spring of water. He had turned the gods against one another, pitting a river god against the king of Olympus himself. In his fury, Zeus had reached into the forbidden architecture of the underworld, tearing at the foundations of Hades's kingdom to punish a mortal, doing so without the Lord of the Dead's consent. Death itself had been halted, a glitch in the divine order that had left the banks of the Acheron empty and the ferryman without a purpose. Hermes stood there, a conduit for the storm, his gold coin clutched in Charon's withered hand. He looked at Persephone, then at the dark, roiling water, and finally back to the girl who shouldn't have been there. The trickster's smile widened, sharp and cold as a scalpel. He knew something was terribly wrong, and he was clearly enjoying every second of the unraveling. As he turned aboard the boat, the snake-topped cane pulsed against Persephone's side, and the messenger offered one last, devastating glance that made it clear. The hunt for the truth had only just begun. The golden halls of the underworld were meant to be a sanctuary of finality, but they had become a theater of cosmic negligence. Hades stood on the balcony, his silhouette a jagged rent in the dark, watching the stagnation of his domain. The rivers, once a bustling highway of departing souls, were unnervingly still. The ledger of the dead had ceased to tick. Zeus, the architect of this absurdity, played with the lives of mortals as if they were nothing more than pawns in a game of divine infidelity. He had ignored the boundaries of the afterlife, manipulating the very essence of mortality to shroud his latest trail of broken promises. He had misled Thanatos, Death himself, into a trap laid by the cunning King Sisyphus. Now the natural order had buckled. The old, the sick, and the broken were denied the mercy of an end. They lingered in a state of agonizing, suspended animation, a grotesque monument to the vanity of a god who refused to be inconvenienced by his own appetites. Hades contemplated the wreckage with a cold, detached fury. He was no stranger to desire. He understood it as the engine of life, the pulse that drove the cycles of the earth to feed the silence of the abyss. But his brother had reduced desire to a disease. Zeus was a slave to his own cravings, a monarch who would burn the world to ash just to see his own reflection in the flames. Hades had felt that same hunger stirring within himself, a reckless, consuming pull toward a girl whose name felt like a prayer in his mind. But that was precisely why he had recoiled. He refused to become the mirror image of his brother. To possess her would be to surrender to the very same rot that had turned his brother into a monster. He had chosen, in a moment of rare and painful lucidity, to lock the gates of his own heart. He was pulled from his contemplation by the sharp, electric vibration of a shift in the air. A presence materialized, Hermes, the messenger, slipping into the dark like a blade into silk. He occupied the throne room with the effortless, grating grace of someone who treated the underworld as a convenient shortcut rather than a hallowed domain. Hades did not turn immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the wall, his voice a low, abrasive rumble that cut through the silence. He spoke of boundaries, of the sanctity of the dark, and of the messenger's own history of looking the other way when thievery was afoot. Hermes, ever the dancer on the edge of a blade, played the part of the indignant innocent. He threw his arms wide, a gesture that rang hollow against the gravity of the room. Hades turned then, his smirk a sharp, bloodless expression. He knew the messenger was not merely a courier, he was a symptom of the chaos above. "If you are so suspicious of me," Hermes began, his voice dancing with a rhythm that hinted at secrets buried deep beneath his playful demeanor, "perhaps I should give you a heads up?" Hades merely stared at him, the weight of the underworld pressing down upon them both. The messenger held all the cards, and the silence that followed was not the quiet of the dead, but the held breath of a trap waiting to be sprung. Hades knew the game had changed, and as Hermes stepped closer, the shadows in the room seemed to lean in, waiting for the king to make the move that would finally shatter the fragile truce of the gods. The air in the throne room was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient decay. Hermes, the golden parasite of Olympus, gestured with his serpent-coiled wand, his grin a sharp, dangerous blade. He spoke of Sisyphus, a man whose cunning had outstripped the gods themselves, and the mess that had turned the underworld into a silent, stagnant tomb. Hades watched him with a weary, practiced detachment, his fingers tracing the cold iron of his own scepter. There was a frantic edge to their conversation, a tension born of a world losing its grip on the inevitable. They required a clean sweep of the earth, and for that, they needed the power of the cycle itself. They needed Ceres. But as Hermes mused on the unpleasant aura of the harvest goddess, his gaze shifted, and a sudden, electric stillness fell over the room. Persephone hung in the periphery, an intruder clawing her way into the center of a divine conspiracy. She was a dripping, shivering wreck, her clothes heavy with the foul, numbing waters of the river Lethe. She had braved the triple threat of the Underworld's waterways, outwitting the boatmen only to be unceremoniously dumped by the messenger who found her persistence amusing. She stood before them now, radiating a stubborn, fiery vitality that made the cold, dark silence of the palace seem suddenly fragile. Hades felt the familiar, jarring thrum of his own pulse. He had tried to build walls, to retract into the safety of his throne, but she was a persistent, bright contagion that refused to be quarantined. When she stepped into his orbit, her eyes searching his face for a sign of rejection, he found himself unable to articulate the words. His silence was not a dismissal, it was a surrender to the inevitable gravity of her presence. She rushed to him, a sudden surge of warmth against his cold, ironclad resolve. She clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe, her excitement a sharp contrast to the creeping dread of the room. Hermes watched, his sharp, observant eyes widening with a sudden, dawning recognition. He looked at her, then back at the king, the gears of the trickster god's mind clicking into place. He knew who she was. The reprieve was short-lived. The heavy doors groaned open, and Ceres entered. She was a vision of haunting, asymmetrical beauty, long, dark hair cascading over a chiton that bared a single, elegant leg, a sickle strapped to her back like a promise of harvest. But as she spoke, the reality of her nature shattered the facade. She spoke with a chorus of voices, a discordant, polyphonic layering of men, women, and slaves that poured from a single, beautiful mouth. It was a sensory assault, an eerie, multifaceted harmony that made Persephone's skin crawl with a primal, instinctive unease. Hermes, sensing the shift in the room, moved with the suddenness of a lightning strike. He ushered Ceres out, vanishing into the fold of space as quickly as he had appeared, leaving the king and the girl alone in the hollow echo of the palace. Persephone stared at the empty doorway, her mind reeling from the voices that still seemed to linger in the air. She looked at Hades, the question she had been dying to ask, the one that had been eating at her from the moment the goddess stepped inside, finally escaping her lips like a curse. "Are you close with her?" Hades remained motionless, his eyes dark, unreadable pits. The palace was silent again, but the weight of his gaze was heavy with secrets that were only just beginning to surface. And in the corner of her eye, Persephone saw the shadows in the room begin to shift, moving with a hunger that had absolutely nothing to do with him. The silence that followed the departure of the goddess was heavy, thick with the scent of smoldering charcoal and the residual echoes of 1,000 voices. Hades retreated into his inner sanctum, a chamber of cold, imperial perfection, where every shadow was placed with the precision of a funeral shroud. Persephone followed, her footsteps sounding like a heartbeat against the obsidian floors. She watched him from the velvet depths of a sofa, her eyes tracing the line of his shoulders, the way the hard, corded muscle of his back flexed with the primal act of tending the fire. He was an enigma of iron and fire, and she found herself utterly, dangerously intoxicated by the sight of him. When he finally turned, settling into the space beside her, the air between them became an invisible, tightening wire. He draped an arm along the back of the sofa, a territorial gesture that sent a jolt of raw electricity through her spine. Her jealousy was a physical thing, sharp and unrefined, clawing at the tranquility he tried to project. She demanded to know of the goddess, of his loyalties, of the hidden currents of his heart. Hades, typically a fortress of untouchable indifference, found his composure eroding under the relentless, messy honesty of this girl who had no right to be here. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and realized the danger wasn't that she was a spy or a threat. The danger was that she was a reflection. She was the mirror that forced him to confront the hunger he had spent eons trying to bury. "Are you jealous?" he teased, though the sound was strained, a low growl of disbelief. She did not flinch. She leaned into the space, her eyes glowing with the reckless intensity of a predator who had found its prey. She accused him of cruelty, of playing with her affections, of igniting a fire he now seemed intent on dousing. Her words were chaotic, immature, and yet they possessed a profound, terrifying truth that bypassed his defenses. He was the king of the dead, a man who had never lived by the rules of restraint, yet he found himself paralyzed. He was a creature who had never been wanted. Not like this, not by a living soul who treated his darkness as a destination rather than a prison. She was planting herself in his life, a wild, unknown seed that threatened to bear fruit that could shatter the very foundations of his realm. "Do you really think I'm playing with you?" she demanded, her hands clutching his shoulders, her grip desperate. He stared at the girl who had defied the gods and outwitted the river, the girl who was currently dismantling his world one breath at a time. He knew that to yield was to invite catastrophe. He knew that to touch her was to accept the inevitable collapse of his isolation. He felt the tremors of his own resolve, the way his restraint was being worn away by the sheer, stubborn heat of her conviction. She was demanding to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be possessed. And as the dark of the palace pressed in around them, Hades realized that he had already lost the war. He had been so busy guarding his gate from the rest of the world that he had failed to notice the one person he had been waiting for had already walked through it. He leaned down, the shadows of the room rising to meet them, and in the space where his denial used to be, there was only the suffocating, beautiful anticipation of what would happen if he finally stopped saying no. The silence in the reception chamber was brittle, shattered by the raw, unvarnished hunger vibrating between them. Persephone did not shrink from the intensity of his gaze. She stood as his equal in this dance of shadows, her defiance a searing contrast to the cold, structured perfection of the underworld. Every word she spoke was a challenge, a claim laid upon the king of the dead that he found increasingly impossible to refuse. When she demanded he want her, the request was not a plea, it was a seizure of power. She was a paradox, a creature of light attempting to anchor herself to the deepest, most morbid darkness. She didn't just ask for his attention, she demanded the entirety of his existence. She wanted the finality of his embrace, the terrifying weight of his world. Hades, whose entire existence had been defined by the accumulation of souls and the stewardship of ends, felt his iron resolve liquefy. He had spent eons mocking the transient passions of the gods above, viewing them as fickle games played by children. But this was not a game. It was a famine finally meeting its feast. As he pulled her closer, the world outside the room ceased to matter. The stagnant silence of the dead, the chaos of the earth, the warnings of the messenger, it all vanished, replaced by the frantic, syncopated rhythm of their breathing. He was drowning, and she was the anchor dragging him down into the beautiful, suffocating depths. Her touch was reckless, a desperate, clumsy exploration of a man she sensed was a titan of buried fires. Hades groaned, the sound a low, tortured vibrato against her skin. He had lived by the principle of restraint, fearing the consequence of becoming a slave to his own desires, but in the face of her relentless pursuit, restraint became a death sentence. He guided her hand, leading her through the terrifying, uncharted territory of his own anatomy. The discovery was a shock that sent a tremor through her very soul. Beneath the heavy, dark fabric of his robes, he was warm, fever-hot and pulsating with a life force that defied the frigid nature of his domain. She felt the velvet weight of him, the rhythmic surging of blood, and the unmistakable evidence of his own unraveling. He was not the static statue of stone she had feared. He was a creature of heat and instinct, caught in a trap of her own making. She gripped him, her movements hesitant at first, then emboldened by the dark, guttural encouragement vibrating in his throat. The texture was strange, alien, and utterly intoxicating. She traced the taut, straining skin, felt the slick, viscous evidence of his arousal coating her palms, and the realization hit her like a physical blow. She had done this. She had brought the king of the dead to his knees. He watched her through hooded, burning eyes, his own hand trapping her wrist, directing the pace, turning her curiosity into a weapon. The air grew heavy, saturated with the metallic scent of desire and the deep, earthy musk of the underworld. She felt her own body responding, a treacherous, blossoming heat that threatened to pull the ground from beneath her feet. She looked up at him, her lips parted, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and triumph. She had wanted to know him, to possess the king of the dead, and now, as his hand tightened over hers and the heavy, stifling atmosphere of the room threatened to consume them both, she realized there was no going back. The gates were closed. The path was lost. And for the first time, she was exactly where she had always intended to be. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, distilling into a singular, agonizing focus. The decorous veneer of the palace was forgotten, replaced by the primitive, pulsing reality of two beings stripped of their divinity and their defenses. Hades, the cold architect of the afterlife, was now an engine of fevered motion, his hands tracing the lines of a girl whose innocence had been incinerated by her own insatiable hunger. She knelt before him, a supplicant at the altar of her own creation. When she took him, the act was not merely one of carnal surrender, it was an act of possession. She navigated the unfamiliar terrain of his desire with the clumsy, fervent dedication of a devotee. The friction, the heat, and the rhythmic, guttural release of his control created a soundscape that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the abyss. His instructions were soft, a low rumble of command that she obeyed with a terrifying, absolute commitment. She was a vessel for his release, her throat and tongue learning the language of his anatomy. She was not just tasting the king of the dead, she was absorbing the essence of the domain she had been so desperate to claim. Every slip of her tongue, every intentional graze of her teeth, was a vow. When he finally pulled her up, the transition was swift, brutal, and inevitable. The silk of her garments, once a shield, became an obstacle, discarded with a flick of her wrist until she was laid bare against the obsidian frame of the sofa. She was a pale, vulnerable landscape for his darker impulses. Hades moved with a predatory grace, his presence looming over her like a thunderstorm about to break. He did not ask for entry, he claimed it. His touch, honed by eons of silence, was suddenly a chaotic, exploring force. He played upon her as if she were a long-forgotten instrument, finding the hidden, shivering notes of her response with a precision that bordered on cruel. The sound of their bodies, a wet, rhythmic collision, was the only music in the vast, hollow palace. Persephone found herself caught in a tide of sensation that defied all the sanitized whispers of her childhood. She was a creature unmade, her body betrayed by the flickers of pleasure that arched her spine and left her gasping into the fabric of the cushions. He was drowning in the heat of her, in the realization that this girl, this anomaly from the sun-drenched gardens above, had become the epicenter of his world. She was the one who had broken his solitude, and in return, he was dismantling the last vestiges of her identity. As his fingers moved deeper, exploring the frantic, rhythmic opening that bloomed in response to his touch, Persephone's breath came in ragged, broken sobs. She was drowning in the excess of her own arousal, the sensation of her own fluid tracing paths of heat down her legs a testament to the surrender she had craved since the moment she first saw him. The king and the girl were lost in a tempest of their own design. The abyss outside was quiet, but within the walls of the palace, the world was ending, only to be forged anew in the searing, impossible wreckage of their union. She called his name, a desperate, fragmented plea that echoed into the rafters, and for the first time in an eternity, the Lord of the Dead was not listening to the prayers of souls, but to the confession of her skin. The air in the chamber had turned viscous, heavy with the scent of spent desire and the primal, metallic tang of the abyss. Hades, usually the stoic sentinel of the grave, had discarded the architecture of his restraint. He moved with a precision that was both terrifying and transformative, his touch a calculated dismantling of the girl who had dared to claim his attention. Persephone was no longer the runaway from the gardens. She was a creature being refined in the fires of the underworld. Her body, a landscape of unmapped sensitivities, responded to his every command with a frantic, pulsing honesty. She was pinned by the weight of his authority, her own resistance dissolving into a desperate, sobbing rhythm. When his fingers probed the deepest recesses of her, she found that the heat she had been carrying, the secret, yearning warmth she had hidden from the world, was finally being given voice. His touch was not merely physical, it was an intrusion into the very sanctity of her spirit. When he marked her, the sharp, stinging slap against her skin left a brand that felt less like pain and more like a claim of ownership. She wept, not out of sorrow, but from the shattering of the fragile, virginal boundaries she had held since the beginning of time. She was being unmade, layer by layer, her identity stripped away to make room for something darker, deeper, and infinitely more demanding. When he finally took her, the transition was a catastrophic collision of two worlds. The sensation of his presence, the sheer, intimidating scale of him, left her gasping, her internal walls yielding with a reluctant, agonizing beauty. He was the anchor, and she was the storm, their movements a synchronized rebellion against the silence of the dead. She clung to the sofa as if it were the only thing tethering her to existence, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged, broken fragments that echoed off the cold stone walls. Hades, his composure fractured by the tightness of her, the way she seemed to swallow him whole, moved with a controlled, rhythmic violence. He was exploring her depths, mapping the contours of her surrender, and finding that she was far more capable of enduring and demanding the intensity of his nature than he had ever anticipated. The sounds of their union filled the room, a wet, rhythmic percussion that seemed to beat in time with the very heart of the underworld. It was an ecstatic, obliterating chorus. Every thrust was a question, every arch of her back an answer. She felt him surging against the deepest, most sensitive nerves of her being, a forceful, tidal expansion that left her senses spinning in the dark. He was the lord of the dead, but in this moment, he was a man consumed by a living hunger. He watched her, his own face a mask of gritted teeth indulgence, observing how the girl who had once been untouched was now flowering under his corruption. She was a ruin of his making, her face flushed, her eyes unfocused and swimming with the intoxicating poison of his touch. As the pace accelerated, the boundaries between them blurred. There was no Persephone, no Hades, only the friction, the agonizing, beautiful heat. She was being thoroughly, irrevocably altered, her very cells vibrating with the cadence of his possession. She was no longer a visitor in his realm. She was an inhabitant, a part of the darkness he had so carefully cultivated. With a final, shattering surge of force, he drove into her, a claim that silenced the very shadows of the room. She arched a low, keening cry escaping her throat as her body betrayed her, pulsing in waves of lightless ecstasy. In the aftermath, as their ragged breathing slowed to match the stillness of the tomb, the girl who had once been known as a maiden of the sun lay corrupted, anchored, and utterly, eternally his. The darkness had found its queen. The quiet that followed their surrender was not the silence of the void, but a heavy, saturated stillness. Persephone lay draped over Hades, a tangle of limbs and spent vitality, her body still humming with the fading echoes of their collision. She was a willow bowed by a storm, anchored to the iron-willed king who had, for a few fleeting hours, traded his sovereignty for her warmth. Hades trailed his fingers along her skin, his touch no longer a command, but a lingering trace of possession. The room felt smaller, the boundaries of the underworld pulled tight around them like a protective cocoon, shielding them from the rotting chaos of the world above. She spoke then, a soft confession that lingered in the stagnant air. The dilemma of her existence hung between them, the suffocating, possessive love of her mother, and the impossible chasm of her return to a life that had never truly belonged to her. To stay was to invite a divine catastrophe. To leave was to surrender the only place where she felt she truly existed. He probed at the edges of her origins, his curiosity tempered by the cold, calculating nature of a god who usually viewed such histories as mere debris in the ledger of time. He asked of parents, of origins, of the rivers that birthed her, a dance of half-truths and strategic omissions. Persephone parried each query with the grace of a practiced conspirator, weaving a shroud of mystery around the dark, jagged reality of her lineage. She was the daughter of a stolen life, a secret festering in the heart of the heavens, yet here, in the dark, she felt an unsettling, newfound power. She clung to him, a creature of light attempting to anchor herself to the eternal night. She asked for the impossible, not just his desire, but the crown of his kingdom. She craved the weight of the throne, the absolute authority of the realm where the sun never rose. It was a jest, a dare, a flirtation with oblivion, but Hades did not laugh. He looked at her, his expression shifting into something that caught the dim light of the abyss and fractured it, an ethereal, dangerous softness. The intimacy was intoxicating, yet beneath the surface, the psychological currents ran deep.
He knew the cost of what she asked.
To make her his queen was to challenge the cosmic order, to invite the wrath of the heavens into his own domain. And yet, looking at her, this resilient, defiant thing that had defied the river and the reach of the gods to be here, he found that the risk had a seductive appeal all its own. He pulled her closer, his voice a low, resonant promise. She had been raised in a cage of adoration and containment, a doll in a garden, and he was the wildfire that had finally burned the walls down. She was a mystery he hadn't yet solved, a tree whose fruit he hadn't yet tasted. As the echoes of their earlier fervor faded, the reality of the impending dawn and the inevitable pursuit of the world above began to press against the threshold of his palace. Hades looked at her, his gaze intense, capturing the flush of her skin and the frantic pulse at her throat. He knew she was a complication he should discard, a problem to be solved, but as he pressed a kiss to the hollow of her neck, he realized he had no intention of letting her go. The game had begun. The queen was already in place. And outside the heavy, obsidian doors, the shadows of the underworld began to shift, preparing to guard the secret that had just been whispered into the dark. The silence of the underworld was a living thing, a heavy shroud that draped over the chamber and muffled the rhythmic, wet sounds of their intimacy. Persephone lingered by the window, her gaze lost in the cold, unreachable silver of the moon. Outside, eternity felt like a fracture, splitting into 1,000 directions, none of which led back to the suffocating gardens of her past. She spoke of shadows and goddesses of sorcery, her voice a fragile probe into the nature of existence, asking if such dark, predatory things could ever be loved. Hades did not offer comfort. He offered the only reality he understood. He pulled her waist against him, the friction a sharp, jolting contrast to the existential weight of her questions. His touch was a reminder. She was no longer a child obeying the dictates of a mother. She was a ruin of his making, her body a map of his own desires. The tension in the room, already stretched to the point of snapping, spiked when a presence manifested in the shadows. It was a maid, a sightless creature whose lack of vision rendered the shame of their naked, frantic union both irrelevant and intensely magnified. Persephone flinched, the red flush of her skin deepening, but Hades merely intensified his hold, his thumb finding the epicenter of her surrender. He was a king indulging in a private, carnal rebellion, uncaring of the witness. He moved within her, a rhythmic, relentless invasion, even as the maid began to recite the grim, sterile business of the underworld. The news was a cold splash of reality, an emptiness where there should have been capture, a failure in the containment of the dark. The Titans, those ancient, seething forces of the abyss, were restless. Hades froze, his eyes narrowing as the reality of the crisis cut through the haze of his arousal. Persephone, caught in the wake of his sudden, violent halt, felt the loss of him like a physical wound. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the hard, unrelenting muscle of his back, her movements desperate and uncoordinated as she tried to coax the fire back into life. She was a woman intoxicated by the new, forbidden nectar of her own corruption, and the prospect of his departure was an agony she could not fathom. He pulled back, his face a mask of iron control, though his eyes still burned with the remnants of the storm. He kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt like a brand, and moved to leave. Persephone stood amidst the shadows, her body still bearing the slick, heated proof of his claim, her skin cool where he had been moments before. The room felt cavernous, the air suddenly thin. She watched him go, the shadow of the king of the dead swallowed by the greater darkness of his own realm. He promised to return, but the promise hung in the air, hollow and fragile. Outside the chamber, the gears of the abyss were grinding to life, and the woman who had traded her innocence for his touch was left alone, realizing that in the land of the dead, nothing, not even the heart of a god, stayed in one place for very long. The silence that rushed back into the room was cold, absolute, and filled with the terrifying certainty that she was waiting for a ghost. The departure of the king left a void in the chambers, a sudden drop in pressure that left the air tasting of cold iron and stagnant longing. Persephone remained, wrapped in the phantom heat of his absence, watching as the silent, sightless servants attended to the cooling embers of their union. These were hollow things, creatures denied the dignity of a voice, moving with the mechanical precision of shadows. They cleaned the evidence of her surrender as if scrubbing away a stain, a chore that felt both clinical and profoundly desecrating. Once the doors clicked shut, the silence of the underworld rushed in to claim the space. Persephone was finally alone with the weight of her own transformation. She felt like a creature being hollowed out and refilled with the dark, heavy nectar of the abyss. Driven by a restless, burgeoning curiosity, she navigated the labyrinthine gloom of the palace. She found the armory, a place where history hung in the air like dust. Rows of cold, unyielding steel stood testament to the ages of war that had forged this kingdom. There, resting on a pedestal of obsidian, was the relic of shadows, the helm of the unseen. To wear it was to become a ghost, to step outside the gaze of destiny itself. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the cold metal, a dark, dangerous thrill curling in her gut. To disappear was the ultimate freedom, but it was also the ultimate deception. Meanwhile, at the jagged threshold of Tartaros, the earth itself groaned under the pressure of the rebellious titans. The subterranean tectonic shift, a cataclysm held in check only by the sheer force of Hades' will, began to settle. Rhadamanthus, the unyielding judge whose very gaze was a verdict, stood sentinel. He looked at his king and saw a crack in the armor of stone. Hades was smiling, a low, predatory, and impossibly warm expression that had no place in the kingdom of the dead. The judge questioned the anomaly, his voice a gravelly rasp of suspicion. He spoke of the surface, of the gods above, and the tangled webs they wove. But Hades moved past him with a careless, arrogant grace, his mind already drifting back to the royal palace. He was a man possessed, his thoughts tethered not to the governance of souls, but to a singular, vibrant, and reckless life that had taken root in his garden of bone. He crossed the brass-fenced grounds, where the living swamp, that insatiable, primeval organism, writhed and bubbled. It claimed the unwary with a wet, hungry snap, reducing servants to nothing more than shredded memories. Hades cast a single, indifferent glance at the latest victim, a soul being unmade by the swamp's teeth, before continuing on. Death was a constant, a mundane rhythm of the underworld, but his preoccupation was elsewhere. He was a man walking toward a fire he had built, a heat that beckoned him home. He had never understood the vanity of earthly desires, but as the golden turrets of his palace rose before him, he felt a frantic, human surge of anticipation. He didn't know what he would find when he opened those doors. Would she be waiting? Had she finally succumbed to the oppressive, suffocating weight of his domain, or was she already claiming it as her own? The king of the dead quickened his pace, his heartbeat echoing against the silence, unaware that in the dark of his bedroom, a small, silver-toned helm was beginning to tilt. The king of the dead returned to a silence that cut deeper than the grave. His palace, an opulent mausoleum of gold and art, stood in perfect, terrifying order, yet the air felt hollowed out. Persephone was gone. She had vanished from the velvet depths of his chambers, leaving behind nothing but the fading scent of her skin and the bitter chill of an empty bed. Hades, usually a bastion of cool indifference, became a storm of frantic, jagged motion. He traversed the rivers of his realm with a desperation that bordered on the feral. He combed the banks of Lethe, where the memory of her should have lingered, and scoured the scorching currents of Phlegethon, but the darkness offered no reflection of her. Even the three-headed shadow beast, his faithful sentinel, slunk back with a low, defeated whine, the scent of her trail lost in the bottomless abyss. For the first time in an eternity, the lord of the underworld looked toward the dim, lunar sky with a gaze that held the tremor of an impossible loss. She was nowhere, as if she were a dream he had hallucinated in the grip of a fever. But deep within the hidden, jagged crevices of the world, a spark remained. Persephone sat in the hollow of a forgotten cave, the guttering flame of a lamp casting long, skeletal shadows against the weeping stone. She was a woman unmoored, her fingers tracing the place where her life, the life of the maiden known as Kore, had been systematically dismantled. She reached for the fine trinket she had taken from his armory, a cold, metallic reminder of her trespass, then cast it aside. It meant nothing. She touched herself, a lingering, ghost-like exploration of her own body, searching for the physical mark of her descent. There was no residue, no bruise, no outward sign of the ritualistic destruction she had endured in his arms. Yet, the woman who had arrived in the underworld was dead. She had been extinguished in the friction and the heat, and in her place sat something colder, something sharper. She was no longer a daughter. She was an architect of her own exile. She stepped out into the night, but the world had fractured. The air that greeted her was thick, briny, and wrong. It was night, an eternal, suffocating night that held no promise of dawn. Her breath hitched in her throat, a cold premonition crawling up her spine like an insect. She ran. Through the tangled, suffocating brush of the forest, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, she broke into a clearing where a singular, golden light defied the gloom. A log cabin, warm and treacherous, stood in the center of the dark woods. And there, standing like a monument of stifling expectation, was the one person she had fled. Her companions, the nymphs, were already there, their faces masks of misplaced relief, their voices a discordant chorus of loyalty. And then the center of the storm turned. Demeter, the goddess, radiant and heavy with a possessive, suffocating love, stood with arms outstretched, an anchor designed to drag Persephone back into the suffocating depths of her garden. The collision was visceral. Persephone threw herself into that embrace, the smell of sun-drenched earth and overripe blossoms hitting her like a physical blow. "Mother," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the lie. But as she buried her face in the golden robes, her eyes, hardened by the dark, wide with the secret of the underworld, did not blink. She had returned, but the girl who had left was a ghost. And beneath the surface, the king of the dead was already beginning his search. The interior of the sanctuary was stifling, a sanctuary in name only, where the air hung heavy with the scent of dried herbs and the unnatural, creeping silence of a mother's watchful gaze. Persephone stood on the threshold, her body vibrating with the residual friction of the underworld, yet she forced herself into the practiced mold of the dutiful daughter. Demeter moved through the space with an unsettling grace, her golden aura casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to claw at the edges of the room. The homecoming felt less like a reunion and more like a closing of a trap. Demeter's touch, usually the soft promise of nurture, now felt like an inspection. As she smoothed Persephone's hair, the goddess's eyes tracked every tremor, every erratic beat of the pulse in her daughter's throat. There was an eerie, suffocating sweetness to the way she spoke, a honeyed tone that masked the razor-sharp edge of her surveillance. When Demeter's fingers grazed the fresh, jagged wound on Persephone's elbow, the room seemed to go perfectly still. The injury was a testament to the night's escape, a secret etched in blood and stone. Demeter's expression did not flicker, but the temperature in the room plummeted, turning the air brittle. She spoke of rot and infestation, of worms gnawing at the grain, her voice dropping into a register that made the very walls seem to recoil. She was not talking about crops. She was talking about defiance. The conversation drifted to the shifting balance of the world above, where the ground itself had turned to bitter, infected soil. Demeter's words were laced with a venomous contempt for the architects of this ruin, the brothers who played with the fate of living things as if they were mere toys. She painted Hades as a creature of madness, a lord of death who held himself above the sanctity of the cycle. Persephone sat frozen, the contrast between the man she had just left and the monster her mother described threatening to tear her mind in two. She remembered the heat of him, the way he had dismantled her composure, the raw, unvarnished hunger that had redefined her existence. To hear him reduced to a villainous caricature felt like a betrayal of the truth, yet she held her tongue, the weight of the lie pressing against her ribs like a physical burden. Her skin flushed, not from shame, but from the searing, visceral memory of the dark. She dared to probe the fracture in her mother's composure, questioning the depth of the animosity between the gods. Demeter's reaction was a sharp, clinical pivot, her eyes narrowing with the sudden, intuitive intelligence of a predator sensing a shift in the prey. The atmosphere thickened, saturated with the metallic tang of unspoken things. Every word felt like a step across thin ice. Outside, the world was held in an unnerving, perpetual darkness, and within the cabin, the light of the lamp sputtered, as if the very flame were afraid to reveal what was truly unfolding. The question hung in the air, a silent, volatile spark, as Persephone realized that she had not escaped the underworld. She had merely brought its shadows into the light, and now they were beginning to show their teeth. The sanctuary, once a bastion of maternal warmth, had become a theater of psychological warfare. Demeter paced the room, her voice weaving a tapestry of caution and cold, calculated fear. She spoke of humans as if they were vermin, arrogant, cunning, and desperate, creatures who would trade their very souls to cheat the inevitable grip of the abyss. Every word was a warning, a jagged shard of truth wrapped in the velvet promise of safety. She painted the world beyond their island as a landscape of thorns and betrayal, a place where those who sought to outsmart death were doomed to lose their humanity in the process. Persephone listened, her pulse a rhythmic traitor against her skin. She played the part of the dutiful vessel, the daughter whose world was bounded by the mother's gaze. But beneath the surface, the memory of the underworld hummed, a dark, resonant frequency that no amount of sanctified incense could drown out. When Demeter pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the back of her hand, the touch felt less like a benediction and more like a brand. It was a claim of ownership. The air in the room grew heavy with the weight of the unspoken. Demeter's love was a chasm. To step into it was to be consumed. She promised indulgence, but her eyes held the chilling detachment of a reaper watching a stalk of wheat lean toward the blade. When she warned of the dangers of the night, describing it as the mouth of the deceitful and the cunning, the irony was thick enough to choke on. Persephone was the one who had walked into the jaws of that darkness, and she had discovered that it was not a grave, but a mirror. Persephone navigated this exchange with the delicate precision of a tightrope walker. She deflected with inquiries about coins, those small, circular tokens of the mortal world that held a fascination far beyond their value. She watched Demeter's reaction, a brief flicker of maternal confusion that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The goddess, so obsessed with control, deemed the request a triviality of the surface world, unaware that Persephone was hunting for the currency of a different realm, the coin that could buy a soul's passage or bribe a judge of the dead. As the interaction drew to a close, a final question hung between them like a blade, suspended by a thread. Demeter's gaze turned, for one terrifying heartbeat, into something utterly hollow, a blue void of absolute cold, before shifting back into the mask of the benevolent parent. Persephone retreated to the isolation of her bed, the ghost of her mother's touch still prickling on her arm. She raised her fingers to the light, staring at the skin that had, until so recently, been pressed against the absolute authority of the king of the dead. She had sworn an oath of eternal fidelity to her jailer, a performance of devotion that was as convincing as it was absolute. But as she lay in the dark, she didn't mourn the loss of her innocence. She traced the phantom lines of the cave walls in her mind, a map etched into her memory. She was the prisoner who had realized that the cage was not the stone, but the love that demanded her total erasure. A small, secret smile touched her lips as she drifted toward sleep. The harvest was coming, but this year the grain would not be the only thing to fall. Outside, the night deepened, waiting for the girl who had learned how to keep secrets from a god. The harvest had yielded its bounty, but the seasons brought no relief to the suffocating golden cage of the island. Demeter's return had transformed the sanctuary into a watchtower, her gaze a constant, invisible tether that kept Persephone bound to the earth after sunset. But time is a fickle creature, and for the girl who had tasted the darkness, 2 months of enforced maternal intimacy felt like a lifetime of starvation. The opportunity arrived in the absence of the sun and the goddess. Beneath the cloak of night, Persephone slipped through the perimeter of the nymph's quarters, her heart a frantic percussion of rebellion. The cave waited, its maw open, inviting her back into the throat of the world. The transition from the mortal realm to the basin of Acheron was seamless, a plunge into a fog so thick it felt like the breath of the abyss against her skin. She had secured the currency of the dead, a coin of cold gold, minted by the whims of the west wind. At the river's edge, the ferryman waited. Charon's reaction was a study in neurotic hostility, his features twisting with a mix of recognition and deep-seated disdain. Yet, when the coin hit his hat, the protest died in his throat. The journey across the river was a descent into a sensory void. The dead, those gray-faced pilgrims, were drifting silhouettes, their existences erased by the mist. Persephone clung to the boat's railing, her senses sharpened to a razor's edge. She felt the chill of the underworld, not as a physical cold, but as an existential weight, the sensation of being unmade. Charon's warnings were layered with a strange, grudging protectiveness, a relic of their repeated meetings. When he finally sounded the great horn, the reverberations rolled through the marrow of her bones, a low, tectonic groan that silenced the very fog. He abandoned her on the desolate bank, his boat retreating into the haze, leaving her stranded in the quiet, expansive misery of the dead. Why she had listened, she couldn't say. Perhaps it was the residual habit of obedience, or perhaps she simply hadn't realized that in the kingdom of shadows, time is not a resource, but a trap. She didn't wait. Impatience, a dangerous, driving hunger, spurred her forward. She followed the signs that pointed toward the infernal river, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. The fog was a labyrinth, mocking her progress, swallowing her path as soon as she forged it.
She stopped.
The silence had shifted. It was no longer the empty, waiting quiet of the riverbank, but a heavy, breathing stillness. Then, the sound began, a low, visceral vibration that made the air tremble. It started in the mist.
Dozens of them.
Unblinking, pale, and ancient.
Eyes.
They hung suspended in the gray gloom, unattached to faces, drifting like malevolent spores toward her pale skin. She was no longer a visitor. She was prey. And in the dark of the underworld, the king was not the only thing that hunted. The mist of the underworld was not merely fog. It was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud that clung to the throat and dimmed the senses. Persephone stood paralyzed as the landscape of death manifested its horrors. It was a macabre carousel of the broken, faces carved away by time and neglect, ribs splayed open like rusted cages, and entities that moved with a predatory, disjointed fluidity. She fought, her hands finding a jagged piece of bone in the debris, a primitive weapon against the encroaching nightmare. The beasts, carrion-starved and mindless, tore at her silk, their teeth grazing her skin in a chilling, rhythmic tally of her mortality. She was a singular point of warmth in a sea of cold decay, and the scent of her living blood was a siren call to the monsters that crawled from the silt of the riverbed. Her breath came in ragged, jagged gasps, each one a plea to a god she feared was already too far away. Then the world shattered. The air was displaced by a sudden, hot gale that smelled of sulfur and ancient thunder. The ground groaned under the impact of a mountain-sized presence. Persephone collapsed, her strength finally failing, her back meeting a surface that pulsed with a life more terrifying than death itself. Above her, the fog parted like a curtain, revealing 3 gargantuan, obsidian-scaled heads. Their eyes were pools of burning, baleful light, each iris a red cavern of eternal hunger. The monster had arrived, and as its maw opened, a dark, yawning abyss that tasted of the end of all things, Persephone was eclipsed. The world turned to darkness, soft and absolute, as she was swallowed whole. In the golden, cold confines of the royal palace, the atmosphere had been brittle for months. The king of the dead had been a man hollowed out. Hades, whose existence was usually as immutable as the bedrock of his realm, had spent 2 months adrift in a silent, jagged rage. He had torn apart the secrets of his own domain, searching the bowels of the swamp, questioning the very marrow of his servants, all for a trace of a girl who had evaporated into the gloom. He had felt the phantom ache of a heart being excised, a grief so profound it threatened to dissolve the borders of his reality. When the great horn of Charon sounded, it was not the signal of a captured thief, but the restoration of a stolen piece of his own soul. He stood silent as his gargantuan guardian deposited the girl into the palace's sanctum. The dead servants scrambled to cleanse her, a clinical ritual that Hades watched with eyes that burned with a turbulent, unreadable fire. She was there. She was alive. And yet, she was a riddle that defied the logic of the gods. She had vanished, yet she had not aged a day. She had bypassed the ironclad laws of the river, crossing borders that were meant to be absolute. Hades stood over her, his own composure held together by the thinnest of threads. He was caught between the overwhelming, desperate urge to crush her against him and the cold, sharp suspicion that something fundamental had shifted. He looked at her, and then he looked at the shadows, his mind narrowing to a single, dangerous conclusion. To cross the Acheron unseen, to escape the grasp of the underworld without a trace, required more than just luck. It required a relic of the gods, or a power he had not yet accounted for. His hand drifted to the space where his own mantle of shadow usually rested. He felt the phantom chill of a discovery that could shatter the fragile peace between the heavens and the abyss. She had returned, but she was no longer merely a girl. She was the ghost in his machine, and she had learned how to play a game where even the king was a pawn. The air in the chamber was thick, saturated with the metallic scent of tension and the lingering musk of an arousal that had no right to exist in the presence of such profound distrust. Hades loomed over her like a sculpture carved from the very foundations of the earth, rugged, unrelenting, and etched with the jagged lines of a man who had been hollowed out by grief and refilled with cold, hard suspicion. Persephone did not shrink. Instead, she moved with the predatory grace of something that had learned to survive in the dark. She was a contradiction, a creature of soft flesh and iron will, pressing herself against him not as a supplicant, but as a claimant. Her touch was intimate, a desperate, sensual negotiation conducted in the silent language of skin and breath. She knew the rhythm of his desire better than the beat of her own heart, and she used it to anchor him, to force him to look at her, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a hunger to be fed. But Hades was a fortress of ice and ancient habit. He resisted, his voice a low rasp that tore through the heated atmosphere, demanding a truth she was not yet ready to give. He questioned her nature, the origin of her survival, his words barbed with the threat of exposure. Every time he spoke that name, Nemesis, the alias that had become a noose, Persephone felt the weight of her deceit pressing against her ribs. The power dynamic shifted with every ragged inhalation. She became a blur of motion, her movements a calculated assault on his composure. There was a raw, almost violent intimacy in the way she sought to ground him, to force him to acknowledge that despite the lies, the distance, and the terrifying chasm between their natures, they were tied by a thread that not even the gods could sever. Hades felt the fracture in his own resolve. It was an involuntary reaction, a biological betrayal, where his body demanded the very thing his mind sought to analyze and dismantle. He was a king who ruled over the end of all things, yet he found himself stumbling in the wake of this girl's erratic, beautiful, and dangerous pulse. "What in the world are you?" he breathed, the question a confession of his own vulnerability. Persephone clung to him, her fingers digging into his skin, her eyes reflecting a manic, desperate sincerity. She was a storm wrapped in a girl's skin, a paradox that had bypassed the centuries of the Acheron and survived the teeth of the abyss. She watched the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the momentary loss of the cynical god who believed he knew the secrets of the dead. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of unvoiced threats and the inevitable collision of their fates. She was no longer just the daughter of the harvest or the prisoner of the garden. She was the architect of his obsession. And as Hades pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her with a desperate, crushing intensity that defied his suspicion, the finality of the moment settled over them. He was holding the catalyst of his own destruction, and for the first time in eternity, the king of the dead did not care. But as their breaths mingled in the dark, the question remained, echoing in the hollows of the palace, unanswered and growing louder. She was a secret he couldn't keep, and he was the cage she was determined to break, or burn down entirely. The air between them was electric, a volatile cocktail of frantic yearning and the cold, sharp edge of a burgeoning obsession. Hades held her with a desperation that bordered on the feral, his grip tight enough to bruise, a tangible manifestation of the 2 months he had spent in a void of his own making. Persephone offered herself up to that possessive heat, her fingers tracing the map of his tension, whispering of love as if it were a prayer or a curse. To Hades, the word was a foreign tongue, a concept he had exiled from his realm alongside the sun. Yet, in the face of this girl, his cynicism was fraying. He offered her the keys to his kingdom, a throne of ash and gold, but his demand for her to stay was tempered by a strange, jagged pride. He wanted her devotion, but he refused to be the one to beg for it, his ego acting as a shield against the frightening reality of his own need. Their fragile communion was shattered by the intrusion of Ceres. She stood at the threshold like an omen, her very presence a frost that settled over the room. She was an anchor to the world Hades had tried to leave behind, her voice a serrated blade that severed the tension between the king and his visitor. As Hades departed, pulled away by the insistent summons of the gods, the silence that fell in his wake was heavy, suffocating, and charged with enmity. Persephone remained on the bed, the linen still holding the fading warmth of his body, her pulse echoing the lingering discord of the encounter. She was not alone for long. Ceres did not leave with the king. She lingered in the doorway, a shadow that had taken solid form, her gaze dissecting Persephone with the precision of a scalpel. There was a history in those eyes, a jealous, icy devotion that recognized a rival before the rival even knew their own role. The air grew thin. Ceres moved into the space, her posture projecting an aura of cold, calculated dominance. She spoke of the king not as a lover, but as a sovereign, a divine entity to whom she had pledged her existence. Her words were a warning, a declaration that she was the constant in Hades' shifting tides, while Persephone was merely the anomaly, the ephemeral, the nymph, the fleeting distraction that had dared to disappear and return. "If you ran away, you shouldn't have come back," Ceres murmured, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. Persephone sat motionless, her composure a thin veil over the roiling turmoil beneath. She saw the truth behind the woman's vitriol, not just suspicion, but the cold, hard ache of a devotion that had been ignored in favor of her own chaotic influence. Ceres claimed to be the most faithful servant, a creature defined by her love for the king of the dead. But as she stood there, blocking the exit, Persephone realized the truth. This was no mere guardian of the throne. This was a sentinel of the status quo, and she had every intention of removing the impurity that had entered the sanctuary. The walls of the room seemed to pulse, the shadows stretching and reaching as if feeding on the malice between the two women. Persephone looked at the woman who dared to love what she herself had already claimed, and for the first time, she felt the true, icy chill of the underworld, not from the dead, but from the living. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not be fought with words, but with the ruthless, quiet violence of those who have everything to lose. And far off, beyond the reach of the living, the king was still oblivious to the fact that his palace was rapidly becoming a graveyard. The air in the chamber had turned stagnant, heavy with the suffocating scent of ozone and unadulterated malice. Ceres was a masterpiece of cold, lethal elegance, her beauty a sharp blade that seemed to draw blood with a mere glance. To Persephone, she was a terrifying reflection of everything the surface world held sacred, radiant, poised, and utterly pitiless. The violence was instantaneous. Fingers, colder than the deepest vein of the Styx, clamped around Persephone's throat. It was not a struggle of strength, but a lesson in total helplessness. As the light in her vision began to fray at the edges, Persephone felt the savage mockery in the goddess's grip. She was being squeezed like an unwanted insect, a nuisance to be discarded before the king could notice her presence. Ceres withdrew, leaving Persephone gasping, her throat a burning map of the goddess's disdain. The rage that surged through Persephone was blinding, a white-hot, tectonic shift in her own psyche. She wanted to scream the truth, to shatter this woman's composure with the weight of her own divinity, but the silence between them was haunted. The room was not empty, it was filled with the discordant, gossiping whispers of the dead, a chorus of phantoms feeding on the friction of the moment. They were judging her, dissecting her, their spectral voices scratching at the walls of reality. "Who are you?" Ceres demanded, her voice a velvet threat. "You aren't a nymph. You're just a girl playing with fire." Persephone didn't answer. She couldn't swear the oath of the Styx, and the goddess knew it. The triumph in Ceres' eyes was absolute. She dismissed Persephone with a flick of her hand, a flick that managed to devalue Persephone's entire existence, reducing her to a mere stowaway in the king's dominion. Once the threat had vanished, leaving the scent of lingering frost, Persephone found herself standing before the armory. Her hand trembled as it hovered over the cap of invisibility. Metal groaned against metal, a sound that resonated in her very bones, as she claimed the relic. The silence that followed was not empty, it was a psychological abyss. In the hollows of her mind, a cold, clinical voice began to whisper. It was the voice of a long-buried truth. She thought of her island, that gilded, suffocating cage of eternal spring, where life was repetitive and meaningless. She thought of the small creatures she had once cherished, the mice, the birds, the rabbits, that had become the early casualties of her own budding darkness. She remembered the way she had felt when they tried to leave. The freedom they possessed, which she lacked, had ignited a perverse, creative cruelty in her blood. She had been the judge, the jury, and the executioner of paradise, crushing vitality under the weight of her own restless envy. The scars on her arms were not just accidents of play, they were badges of a nature that had always leaned toward the abyss. The nymphs had wept for the things she had broken, labeling her a monster, unaware that they were merely observing the awakening of a predator. Now, standing in the heart of the underworld, the voice whispered again. Kill her. It was a simple, elegant solution. A way to reclaim the space that Ceres had dared to occupy. Persephone's reflection in the polished surface of the helmet was distorted, unfamiliar. She realized then that she hadn't come to the underworld to be rescued. She had come to find a place where her own inner rot could finally bloom without being labeled a tragedy. She clutched the helmet, the cold metal biting into her palms. The path forward was clear, and the shadows were already opening wide to welcome her. The boundary between the observer and the predator had dissolved. Clad in the stolen shroud of invisibility, Persephone moved through the palace grounds not as a girl, but as a silent, inevitable consequence. She found Ceres standing near the edge of the mire, her back a taunting invitation. It was a tactical mastery that defied logic. The hat of shadows made her a phantom, untraceable even to the eyes of gods. She did not hesitate. The steel in her hand was cold, a biting contrast to the feverish heat blooming in her chest. The strike was sudden, an explosion of movement that shattered the stagnant quiet of the underworld. Ceres' scream was a jagged tear in the air, but before it could fully echo, Persephone's hands, driven by a hunger that had been gestating since her time in the golden cage, dragged the goddess toward the waiting hunger of the swamp. The mire did not just hold her, it devoured her. It surged upward like a living, viscous serpent, sealing itself around the immortal form with a greed that mirrored Persephone's own. The cloak that had masked her movements was discarded into the sludge, a final sacrifice to the dark. As the last of the goddess vanished beneath the surface, the adrenaline began to curdle into something far more toxic, the cold, agonizing clarity of consequence. She was immortal, and so was her victim. This was not a murder, it was an act of eternal erasure. She had not ended Ceres. She had merely buried her in the very foundation of the realm Hades called home. Dread, heavy and leaden, settled in her gut. She had bypassed the laws of death, and the weight of her transgression was beginning to press against the fragile reality she inhabited. She retreated, her movements frantic, eyes scanning the shadows for witnesses that did not exist. At the entrance to the royal audience, she saw them, Hades, his features carved from stone, and Hermes, the herald of the gods. Between them knelt a man whose presence radiated a dark, defiant dignity. It was Sisyphos, the architect of his own damnation. The man who had looked at the gods, looked at the Styx, and chose to play the game of mortality. Seeing him, knowing the depth of the cosmic price he was currently paying, the realization of her own sin hit her with the force of a falling mountain. If he was to be chained in Tartaros for the audacity of his deceit, what corner of the abyss was reserved for her? She fled back to the sanctuary of the bedroom, a ghost haunting her own life. She scrubbed her skin, searching for the phantom splatter of blood, her hands trembling as she returned the relic of shadow to its hook. Her reflection in the mirror was that of a stranger, a creature with eyes that had seen the bottom of the swamp and found it pleasant. Time stretched, warping into a surreal, agonizing loop. She sat in the silence, waiting for the footsteps of a king who did not yet know that his favorite follower had been silenced by the girl he had tried to keep safe. The internal voice, that seductive, twisted version of her own reason, began its rhythmic, persuasive chant again. It whispered of further actions, of the necessity of the act, of the inevitable path she was carving. There was no turning back now. The choice had been made in the mud, and the consequences were currently rising to the surface of the swamp. She watched the door, her heart a frantic bird in a cage, waiting to see if Hades would walk through it as a lover, or as the judge she had just ensured she would never be able to face. The king of the dead returned to the silence of his palace, but it was a silence that had grown teeth. Hades found his chambers hollow, devoid of the girl whose pulse had recently disrupted the static, rhythmic decay of his world. She was a phantom that refused to be anchored, a volatile spark in a realm that thrived on absolute zero. His mind wandered to the prisoner, Sisyphos, currently waiting for the finality of the abyss. The king of Corinth was a man of infinite, arrogant maneuvers, a mortal who believed he could play the gods like a seasoned gambler. Sisyphos had gambled his soul on a lie, a performative tragedy meant to tug at the heartstrings of a ruler who did not possess one. But Hades was not moved by the man's petty, rehearsed misery. There was no pity here, only the cold, unblinking indifference of an entity that viewed the machinations of mortals as one might view the desperate buzzing of flies against a window pane. Yet, even as he weighed the fate of the deceiver, his thoughts bled back to the girl. The weight of his own desire was beginning to feel like a structural failure. He, who had maintained the borders between the earth and the void for centuries, was now contemplating the heresy of binding her. Not with chains, but with a possession so total it would rewrite the geography of his own morality. The thought, to feed her the fruits of the underworld, to anchor her to his dark soil so she would never again crave the light of the surface, was a poison. It was a violation of everything he stood for, yet the prospect sent a dark, intoxicating shiver through his marrow. He was a man who had become a beast, caught in a fever of his own creation. He had looked at the girl and seen his own ruin, and yet he found himself starved for the sight of her again. A soft sound broke the quiet. He turned, the heavy cloak of his own cynicism momentarily slipping. There she was. Persephone stood at the edge of the shadows, her presence shifting the air in the room, making the very darkness feel vibrant. She looked at him with an innocence that was, by now, clearly a masterpiece of misdirection. She was a creature of 1,000 secret lives, and she was waiting for him to decide if he would be her master or her next victim. Hades felt the familiar, dangerous pull, the gravitational force of her existence. He didn't move.
He didn't speak.
He simply stood there, absorbing the sight of her, his own internal fortress buckling under the pressure of a yearning he hadn't known he was capable of holding. Outside the palace, the swamp held its breath, concealing the remains of a goddess who had dared to stand between them. Inside, the king was deciding whether to swallow his pride or be consumed by the girl. He walked toward her, the sound of his footsteps like the slow, rhythmic beating of a drum. "Tell me," he whispered, his voice a blade of rough silk against the stillness, "are you here to be kept, or are you here to finish what you started?" The sanctuary of the underworld had become a theater of shadows and fevered intent. When she stepped into his chamber, the air shifted, weighted by the scent of the surface, a ghostly reminder of the world he had forsaken. Hades, the immovable architect of the abyss, found his composure unraveling like frayed rope. He had spent months consumed by a hollow, gnawing ache, only to have the source of that void return with a predatory grace that defied his authority. There was no negotiation left. She moved with a calculated, ruthless intimacy, blindfolding him with a sliver of silk that plunged his world into absolute, sensory darkness. In the absence of sight, every touch became a weapon. The brush of her hand, the rhythmic slide of her skin against his, it was a sensory assault that bypassed his mind and struck directly at the core of his dormant hungers. The girl who had once been a nymph of the sun was now something entirely different, a creature of calculated intensity. Her touch was not a plea, it was a demand. When she bent to him, her presence became all-consuming, a desperate, breathless surrender that silenced the gods, the laws of the river, and the growing suspicion that had paralyzed him for days. The room was filled with the sounds of their fraying restraint, the sharp intake of breath, the wet, rhythmic cadence of their friction, and the low, guttural groans that escaped Hades despite his efforts to remain a wall of stone. She was a paradox, a storm of soft flesh and iron-willed obsession that seemed to thrive on the very friction of the act. In a moment of eerie, ritualistic madness, she introduced the heat of melting wax, a searing contrast to the chill of the underworld. It was a physical manifestation of the burning fixation she had spoken of, an agony she insisted they share. Hades, the king of the dead, found himself pinned not by iron shackles, but by the weight of her body and the incomprehensible, beautiful cruelty of her desire. He wanted to push her away, to dismantle this trap, but his resolve was dissolving in the face of her unrelenting, shuddering rhythm. As she took him into her, the threshold of pain and pleasure blurred into a singular, blinding point of contact. She was tight, a velvet constriction that felt as though it were attempting to consume him entirely. Every movement was a negotiation of boundaries, a raw and desperate struggle where he found himself losing his grip on the identity he had guarded for eons. "Stay with me," he rasped, the command lost in the tide of his own losing battle. She didn't answer with words. She answered with a deeper, more frantic synchronization, her moans punctuating the thick, humid air of the room. She was broken, hurting, and yet she drove herself harder, a martyr to a passion that defied the natural order. As the frantic energy peaked, Hades finally tore the blindfold away, his eyes wild with the realization that he had been completely undone. Below him, the evidence of their collision was raw and pulsing. There was no room left for logic, no space for the king to retreat. In the heat of the fever, the barrier between them had been burned away, leaving behind only the terrifying, pulse-pounding truth that in the darkness of the palace, he was no longer the one in control. The fire continued to burn, unquenched, as the shadows outside the door began to stir with the weight of the secret they had just cemented in blood and desire. The chamber was a cathedral of shadows and sweat, where the only law recognized was the relentless, driving rhythm of their collision. Hades, a man who had existed for eons in the icy vacuum of detachment, found his fortress not just breached, but set aflame. He watched her beneath him, a masterpiece of porcelain skin and unbridled, masochistic fervor. Every word she whispered was a tether, a frantic, desperate declaration of love that felt less like a confession and more like a binding spell. He surrendered to it. He mirrored it with an intensity that bordered on the ruinous, raining down promises he had never intended to make, his voice a low, gravel-throated rasp that spoke of a devotion he had spent his entire existence avoiding. She craved the sting. She demanded the friction, the heat, the very pain that he had once considered anathema to his nature. When the wax dripped, a slow, liquid trail of amber heat across the swell of her chest, it wasn't just a transgression, it was a conversation. She thrived on the agony, turning the searing touch into a catalyst for a pleasure so sharp it bordered on the transcendent. He watched her shudder, her body a taut, quivering instrument responding to his every thrust, his every calculated mark. It was a cycle of beautiful, erotic violence. As the rhythm deepened, the room seemed to shrink, the air thick with the metallic tang of arousal and the scent of spent energy. Every time he moved, her internal walls tightened, a desperate, muscular anchor that seemed to beg him to tear her apart. There was a dark, almost ghoulish humor in it. The king of the dead, a man who governed the finality of all things, being brought to his knees by a girl who found her greatest vitality in the brink of breaking. When the release finally tore through her, it was a silent, convulsive storm. She clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a universe of ghosts, her body racked by tremors that echoed the seismic shift in his own soul. He held her, his limbs heavy with a languid, satisfied fatigue, his mind, usually the razor-sharp judge of the damned, muted by the heavy fog of intimacy. But as the echoes of their union faded, the silence of the underworld rushed back in, cold and inquisitive. Persephone, curled against him, began to weave a different kind of thread. Her questions were no longer about the pleasure of the moment. They were about the architecture of justice. She asked of forgiveness. She asked of the nature of his judgment. Hades felt the shift instantly. The erotic haze didn't fully dissipate, but it was pierced by the sharp, familiar needle of suspicion. He looked down at her, tracing the line of her shoulder, noting the way her eyes flickered, not with the post-climax glow he expected, but with the cautious, hunted look of someone standing on the precipice of a confession. He spoke the truth of his office, his voice steadying into the cold, clinical tone of the judge. He was a king, and a king who did not punish. Sin was a king who invited chaos. The weight of his own words seemed to press down on her. Why was she asking about the mechanics of retribution? Why did the specter of a crime haunt the space between them now, when only moments ago they had been a single, frantic entity? He watched her carefully, his fingers stilling against her skin. The comfort was gone, replaced by a sudden, creeping chill. He had just laid bare his willingness to forgive her anything, and she had responded by asking exactly how he would destroy someone who had betrayed him. The trap was closing, but he couldn't tell if he was the one who had set it or the one who was caught inside. The air between them had settled into a heavy, suffocating warmth, the kind of quiet that follows a storm but lacks the clarity of true peace. Persephone lay against him, her skin still flushing with the heat of their shared transgression, her eyes searching his with a depth that felt increasingly predatory. She spoke of Sisyphos, the man chained to his own hubris, as if his torment were a cautionary tale she was eager to dissect. Hades dismissed the prisoner, his voice a cold anchor of absolute judgment. To him, the deceiver was a static problem, a case file to be closed, but Persephone's curiosity clawed at the edges of his indifference. She pressed him with questions that felt like invisible barbs. She asked of death, of the finality of justice, and of the capacity for mercy. Every word she uttered was a calculated vibration against his ironclad psyche, designed to erode the distance he struggled to maintain. Hades felt his skepticism fracturing, her apparent concern for his safety, that he might be harmed by the very forces he commanded, was a seductive, narcotic comfort. He found himself unspooling, his vigilance softening as he traced the line of her throat, letting the silence between them fill with the dangerous promise of eternity. But Persephone was not content with the comfort of his arms. She demanded certainty, and in the underworld, certainty is a currency that demands a sacrifice. She asked for an oath. Not a hollow whisper in the dark, but the invocation of the Styx, the primordial current that bound the gods themselves. To swear by the river was to tether one's soul to the bedrock of reality. It was a pact that transcended the fickle nature of the divine. Hades, the steward of this very domain, felt the sudden, icy constriction of the demand. He saw her jealousy, the way she mirrored the insecurities of a mortal lover, but there was something too smooth, too practiced in her resolve. He pushed back, his own suspicion rising like a dark tide. If she wanted his vow, he demanded a truth in return. The mask of the naive girl slipped, just for a fraction of a second, before she offered a name. Hecate. The name hung in the room, thick and viscous. It was a catalyst. Hades' mind, usually a labyrinth of controlled order, suddenly swiveled toward the dark corners he had ignored for centuries. He realized, with a jarring sense of dislocation, that the goddess of the crossroads had been a phantom in the peripheral of his life during every pivotal moment of the girl's presence. Hecate, the twisted, erratic force of the night, had been the architect. The realization arrived like a physical blow. The suspicion he had harbored for the girl was redirected toward the shadow that had been guiding her hand. He looked down at Persephone, his grip tightening as the pieces of a puzzle he had known he was playing began to lock into place. She was swearing on the eternity of the river, her eyes wide and burning with a conviction that felt less like love and more like an initiation. He was the king of the dead, a being of ancient, stagnant power, and yet, as he stared into her gaze, he felt the sickening, thrilling sensation of having been led exactly where he was meant to go. The secret was laid bare, but the question remained, was he the one who had finally captured the girl, or had Hecate just delivered the master of the underworld to his own unraveling? The confession hung in the stagnant air of the palace, brittle and sharp. Hecate. The name alone felt like a shadow cast over the heart of the abyss, a goddess of crossroads, flickering nights, and the kind of erratic mischief that usually amounted to nothing more than annoying the inhabitants of the dark. Yet, hearing Persephone link her name to the hidden paths of his kingdom sent a cold, speculative shiver down Hades' spine. She wove a tale of a forgotten cave, of dawnlit flowers, and a stray curiosity that led her to stumble through a crack in the fabric of the underworld. It was a story woven with the precision of a trap, and for reasons he could no longer articulate, Hades found himself wanting to believe every fragile word. He looked at her, this girl who was not a nymph, whose origins remained a blur of half-truths, and felt the iron bars of his own judgment melting. He had spent his eternity watching souls pass through his gates, weighing their sins against the cold, unyielding scales of justice. But here, With her, the scales had tipped. He gave the oath. He bound himself to the Styx, a vow of protection that echoed through the very foundations of his realm. The words carried the weight of eternal law, yet he spoke them with a smile that felt dangerously close to surrender. In that moment, he wasn't the king of the dead. He was a man mesmerized, willingly stepping into a snare he had spent centuries avoiding. Lovers. The word felt foreign, a strange, sweet weight on his tongue. He had lived in the singular silence of his throne for so long that the idea of a companion, of someone tethered to him by choice rather than by duty, felt like a fever dream. He watched her, noting the possessive gleam in her eyes, the way she staked her claim with a jealousy that flattered him more than he dared to admit. He told himself there was no hurry. He could afford to be patient. She belonged to the sun-drenched world above, a slave to the light, but he knew the nature of the tides. Eventually, all things drifted down to him. He would wait. He would let the mystery unravel, piece by agonizing piece. But as the night deepened into a heavy, velvet void, the bed grew cold. Hades stirred, the phantom warmth of her body still imprinted against his side. The room was empty. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the breathless intimacy that had occupied the space only hours before. He didn't rise in a panic, nor did he hunt through the shadows as he once had. There was a strange, haunting certainty in his marrow. She would return. He felt a dark, internal smile creep across his lips. He was the king of the underworld, and she was a gift from a night he hadn't yet learned to fear. Unbeknownst to the sleeping king, the door to his armory stood slightly ajar. In the dim light of the side chamber, a single hook hung empty. The cap of invisibility was gone, and with it, the girl who had promised him an eternity of love. As Hades drifted back into the grasp of Morpheus, he remained oblivious to the fact that his kingdom had just been violated, not by a god, but by the very thing he had mistaken for his own salvation. The game was no longer being played in the light. It had moved into the shadows, and Persephone had just made her first real move. The morning light in the underworld is not a sunrise, but a slow, rhythmic deepening of the shadows. Hades stepped from his palace into an atmosphere that felt heavy with a fresh, metallic rot. The palace gate, usually a monument of silent obsidian, was crowded. The restless dead had gathered in a shivering mass, their hollow eyes fixed on the mire that bordered the courtyard. The swamp, that ancient, mindless scavenger that sustained itself on the forgotten, was in a state of violent rejection. It heaved, the dark, viscous liquid churning as if afflicted by a sickness. It was not consuming today, it was expelling. With a sound like thick, wet parchment tearing, it vomited up the remnants of what it had tried to digest. A figure crawled from the sludge, a horrific mosaic of bone and half-knitted flesh. It was Ceres, the goddess of decay, but she had been stripped of her cold, lethal elegance. What emerged was a shuddering, broken thing. Her hair was a matted shroud of mud, her throat a jagged, raw gap that could only produce the bubbling, frantic sound of a drowning creature. Hades stood over her, his presence as still as a tombstone. He looked down at the goddess who had once been the gatekeeper of Tartaros, now reduced to a wiggling, skeletal ruin. She was a testament to a cruelty that he had not anticipated, a precision-cut agony that had shredded her body and left her to the slow, agonizing digestion of the swamp. Ceres clawed at the mud, her fingers brittle like bleached twigs. She reached for him, her intent burning through the haze of her mangled consciousness. She tried to scribe a name into the wet earth, but the muck reclaimed the ground before she could finish a single stroke. Her fingers snapped under the pressure of her own desperation, the bone protruding through gray, papery skin. Hades knelt, the swamp water swirling around his boots. He watched her struggle, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold divinity. "What happened, Ceres?" he asked, his voice devoid of pity, echoing like stone against stone. She gasped, the effort of speech turning her lungs into a bellows of agony. She clawed at his ankle, pulling herself toward him. The sounds that tore from her throat were grotesque, a desperate, gargling refrain.
Nymph.
The name, or the implication of it, shattered against the silence. Hades frowned, the motion barely perceptible. He had heard the girl's voice from the night before, the haunting, theoretical question she had posed about the death of death. It was a fragment of a conversation he had dismissed as the idle curiosity of a lover, but looking at the ruin before him, the pieces began to shift into an unsettling, jagged geometry. He did not rush to judgment. He did not summon his guard to hunt for the culprit. Instead, he signaled for the dead to haul the broken goddess to the cleansing waters of the Styx. He would let the river do its work. He would let time settle the marrow back into her bones. As they dragged her away, Ceres left a trail of dark, viscous fluid on the ground. Hades watched the smear, his gaze lingering on the empty air where she had been. He thought of his chambers, of the empty spot on the wall where the relic of shadows usually hung, and of the girl who had promised him eternity with a kiss. The mystery was a thread, and he was beginning to realize that the end of it was wrapped around his own heart. He turned back toward the palace, his stride slow, measured, and dangerously calm. He would wait. He would let the girl return, let her weave her next lie, and see if she was as perfect a hunter as she appeared to be. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the sensation that the silence of the palace had changed. It no longer felt like an empty room. It felt like the space where a predator stops and waits for its prey to walk into the light. The king of the underworld was a man untethered. In the quiet, suffocating gloom of his realm, the word lovers had become a recurring ghost, haunting the corridors of a mind that had spent eons cataloging the cold finality of death. Hades moved through his own palace like a stranger, his attention frayed, his focus stolen by the persistent, phantom ache of an absence that refused to be satisfied. He frequented the docks of the Acheron, a silent sentinel amidst the shifting, gray mists. Charon, the ferryman of the damned, watched the king's descent into this new, jagged anxiety with a cynical eye. Hades waited for a girl who had no schedule, who promised eternity and delivered only glimpses, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the dead themselves. He even left coin for the journey, a kingly bribe to ensure she would never be blocked from reaching his side. But the days bled together, leaving him standing by the Styx, watching the broken, submerged form of Ceres, whose very existence was a grotesque testament to a violence he had not yet reconciled. Why had she not returned? The doubt was a rot. He had sworn by the river. He had offered his own dark sanctuary as a shelter, and yet, the girl, this impossible, elusive creature who claimed to love him, was nowhere to be found. Then, the trial of Sisyphos brought the chaos to a head. The king of Corinth sat in his cage like a man who had never known the sting of defeat. He wore his own delusion like a crown, his eyes bright with a sharp, frantic intelligence. Hades approached him with the heavy, weary indifference of a judge who had seen every flavor of human deceit, but Sisyphos had a hook. He spoke of the girl. He spoke of her as if she were a commodity, a piece of gossip traded in the shadows of the afterlife. Hades felt the world tilt. The suspicion that had been a quiet murmur in the back of his mind suddenly surged into a roar. How could this prisoner, buried in the bowels of the underworld, know the intimate architecture of his private life? How could he speak of the girl with such casual, venomous familiarity? The words that spilled from the prisoner's lips were a labyrinthine trap. Sisyphos painted a picture of a connection that felt uncomfortably public, as if the secret they had forged in the heat of his chamber had already been dissected and displayed to the vultures of the afterlife. Each sentence was a barb, a psychological calculation designed to drive a wedge between Hades and his own reality. The king stood rigid, his silence a shield against the man's erratic, mocking laughter. Sisyphos was a trickster, a man who built his legacy on the art of the lie, but there was a flicker of truth in his eyes, a terrifying confirmation that Hades had been watched, observed, and whispered about in the dark. Hades turned away, his heart a cold stone, but the seed of distrust had taken root. The girl was not just a missing lover, she was a variable in a game he was only beginning to understand. And as he left the cage behind, he realized the most dangerous truth of all. Someone had been pulling the strings of his reality, and the girl he thought he was protecting was at the very center of the tangle. The king was no longer waiting for a lover. He was waiting for an explanation, and the next time the shadows parted, it would not be with a kiss, but with the cold, unyielding weight of the truth. The king of the underworld stood at the center of his own silence, the air in the palace turning brittle. Sisyphos, that architect of human ruin, had left a sting in the air, a bitter, lingering poison that Hades couldn't quite purge. The prisoner had spoken of the girl not as a lover, but as a phantom, a construct of mockery that had turned the lord of the dead into a puppet of his own desire. Hades laughed, a sound like grinding stone, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. He dismissed the man, turning his back on the cage with a disdain that was meant to be absolute. Yet, as he walked away, the molasses-slow drag of his footsteps betrayed the turmoil beneath his skin. The doubt was no longer a whisper, it was a rhythmic pulse in his temple. Could a mortal, even one as cunning as the king of Corinth, truly read the geography of a god's heart? Hades had always been the observer, the judge, the unblinking eye of the abyss. To find himself the observed, the subject of Sisyphos' pity, was a humiliation he struggled to digest. He retreated to his chambers, seeking the familiar, cold comfort of his domain. But the room felt different. The shadows seemed to lean in, whispering of the void left by her absence. His thoughts drifted to Ceres, the broken, skeletal ruin he had sent to the river, and the maddening, repetitive syllable she had gasped, nymph. It was a label that felt increasingly like a lie. If she were merely a nymph, why did the fabric of his reality feel so frayed? He found himself standing before the door to his armory, a room of relics from a war fought before time had a name. He stepped inside, his eyes piercing the gloom with a predatory focus. The walls were hung with the tools of his conquest, the blade that had crippled titans, the spear that had claimed the necks of giants. They stood in silent, orderly rows, mocking him with their permanence. But the hook was empty. The cap of invisibility, a treasure that allowed the wearer to walk the halls of the gods without a footprint, was gone. He didn't panic. Instead, a chilling clarity descended. He had anchored his entire belief system on her oath to the river Styx. He had allowed himself to be lulled into the comfort of her supposed obsession, interpreting her violent jealousy as the raw, unrefined byproduct of love. He had convinced himself that the Styx could not be fooled, that the weight of an immortal oath was an insurmountable seal of truth. Yet, as he stared at the empty hook, the foundational pillars of his trust began to crack. Was it love that had driven her to eliminate the gatekeeper, or was love merely the mask worn by a far more dangerous ambition? He was a god who had governed the end of all things, yet he had allowed a question to take root in his soul. If the oath was absolute, then perhaps the truth was far more terrifying than a lie. Perhaps she had not sworn to him at all, but to the very power he had underestimated. He stood alone in the dark room, the silence of the armory pressing against him. The girl who claimed to love him had taken the power to walk unseen through his palace, and for the first time in an eternity, the king of the dead realized he was no longer the only hunter in the dark. The throne room of the underworld had become a vault of cold, clinical speculation. Hades, the master of all that is finalized, found himself navigating the terrifying ambiguity of the living. The cap of invisibility was gone, and with it, the girl who had occupied the throne of his desires. He turned to the shadows of his palace, questioning the servants who moved like ghosts, but found only blank, obsidian silence. He summoned Charon, the ferryman who had carried her across the Acheron, and found that his own trust had been the very blindfold she used to lead him into a trap. He had waited. He had been patient. He had been a fool. The report from the surface had arrived. No trace of the nymph Neosis. It was a mathematical impossibility. A mortal could not simply vanish from the fabric of the earth unless they had never truly existed at all. Then, the heavy doors groaned inward. A staff, crowned with the sigil of twin serpents, heralded the arrival of the messenger god. Hermes entered with a casual, kinetic energy of one who treats divinity as a passing whim, his presence jarring against the solemn, deadened air of the abyss. He was the courier of the heavens, the only one capable of cutting through the veil between the living and the lost. Hades did not indulge in the usual theater of court. He went straight to the jagged heart of the matter. He needed a tracker, someone who could peer through the shroud of the surface world to find a girl who was surely not what she claimed to be. Hermes, always wary of the political quicksand that came with doing favors for the king of the dead, tried to retreat behind a mask of jocularity. But Hades' desperation was a gravity well, pulling the conversation into a dark, focused orbit. "Find her," Hades commanded, his voice a low, vibrating tremor of command. "Identify her origin. I suspect she is no nymph." Hermes hesitated, the air suddenly thick with an unspoken memory. The name Miosis was a key, and it unlocked a door in the messenger's mind that had been gathering dust. He recalled the girl who had clamored to cross the river, the one who had seemed so frantic, so tragically mortal. His thief's eyes, which could spot a truth hidden in a mountain of lies, began to piece together a face he had seen in the gardens of the gods, a face draped in the stifling, protective shadow of a grieving mother. The messenger looked at the king, whose obsession had clearly blinded him to the pedigree of his own prey. "Before I go, tell me," Hermes murmured, leaning on his staff, his eyes tracing the hollowed-out intensity in Hades' expression. "Why does the daughter of Demeter call to you, sir? And why do you seem so haunted by her?" Hades stilled. The question hung in the air like a blade. The king looked at the messenger with a confusion that was agonizingly genuine. The name, the daughter of the harvest, the girl who lived under the suffocating gaze of the Earth Mother, was an intruder in his mind. "What are you babbling about?" Hades asked, his voice sharp with a genuine, unsettling dissonance. "I know nothing of Demeter's daughter." The room went dead silent. Hermes' confidence fractured. He realized with a jolt that the king of the underworld hadn't just been deceived by a clever girl, he had been erased. The girl who had seduced him, the one who had sworn by the Styx and vanished with his relic, had not just used a pseudonym. She had walked into the palace of the dead, claimed the heart of a god, and convinced him that he had never even met the woman whose name was etched into the very soil of the world above. She wasn't hiding. She had rewritten the memory of a god. The name Persephone hung in the stagnant air of the throne room, a jagged shard of truth that pierced the heavy veil of Hades' confusion. Hermes, having delivered the blow, stood with an expression of detached realization. He had seen the daughter of the harvest before, hidden behind the walls of a secret garden, guarded by a mother whose love was a suffocating fortress. That she had breached the underworld was not merely a curiosity, it was a cosmic impossibility. Hades felt the world settle into a sudden, icy stillness. The girl, the one who had sweltered against his skin, the one who had whispered of eternal devotion while her fingers traced the lines of his soul, was a fabrication. She was not a nymph of the woods, but a child of the light, a creature of the very realm he had spent his existence balancing against his own. He returned to the cage. Sisyphos waited, his face a mask of predatory eagerness. The prisoner's tongue, like a serpent flicking between thin, parched lips, promised the final piece of the puzzle. He demanded an oath, an invocation of the Styx, as if the prisoner were the one holding the scales of justice. Hades, bound by the very vows he had once considered absolute, felt the weight of those shackles tightening. He thought of her voice, the honeyed, desperate cadence of her promises, as she had sworn her fidelity on the river. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that he had not been wooed. He had been shackled by the weight of a divine contract. She had used his own code of law, the unyielding nature of the Styx, to anchor him to a lie so perfect that he had fought to protect it. Sisyphos began to speak, his words a deluge of artifice and calculated cruelty. He spun a tale of that night, of the movements, the intentions, and the cold reality behind the girl's arrival. The story was bloated, exaggerated, and yet it resonated with the hollow ache in Hades' chest. It connected the dots between the missing relic, the broken goddess of decay, and the absolute ease with which a girl, a mere mortal in his eyes, had dismantled his vigilance. As Sisyphos finished his frantic confession, The room seemed to shrink. Hades stood, his movements fluid and terrible. Everything had been a stage. Every breath she had taken against his throat, every protest of love, every moment of jealous performance, it had all been designed to reach this point. He had been a sovereign of the dead, a judge of the absolute, and yet he had allowed his heart to be blinded by a performance that would have made the gods themselves blush. He looked at the human, the creature of lies, and saw a mirror of his own foolishness. He had fallen for a construct, a lie wrapped in the skin of a lover. The misery was not in the betrayal itself, but in the terrifying perfection of it. He had wanted to believe in a love that could defy the laws of his realm, and she had simply given him the theater of his own desire. The king turned away, his shadow stretching long and dark across the floor. He had learned the truth of his lover, but as he stepped into the gloom, he felt a deeper, more chilling realization. The trap was not that she had lied to him. The trap was that he was still, against all reason, waiting for her to come back. The air on the island was thick with the scent of stagnant blooms and the suffocating vigilance of a gilded cage. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was brittle, vibrating with the sort of nervous energy that precedes a landslide. Persephone sat by the window, a silhouette framed by moonlight that seemed to bleed into the floor, her eyes fixed on a horizon that offered no solace. To the nymphs attending her, she was a fractured mirror of her former self, once a girl of effortless grace, now a creature of sudden, erratic shifts and chilling silences. In the hallways, the whispers were sharp, dripping with the venom of long-held resentment. Arethusa and Keen stood among the shadows of the servant quarters, their faces taut with the strain of their hidden roles. They were the silent audience to a tragedy they could not name, bound to an island that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a penal colony. The dark humor of their situation was not lost on them. They were handmaidens to a deity whose very presence felt like a tightening noose. There was a peculiar, quiet cruelty in Persephone's recent evolution. The nymphs remembered the girl who would shatter birds' nests and tear apart the rare, delicate life of the island, only to dissolve into tears and perform the role of the remorseful child. But now, the tears had dried, leaving behind a cold, calculating stillness that was far more unnerving. She was no longer a child making mistakes. She was a predator mastering the art of the masquerade. The decision was made in the dark, a silent pact forged in mutual suspicion. They would watch. They would peel back the layers of her nightly disappearances, driven by a desperate need to protect themselves from the inevitable fallout of her behavior. They were tired of being the collateral damage in her game of shadows. Behind the heavy, locked door, the girl who had once played the part of the innocent captive was busy erasing her own tracks. Persephone sat in the dark, her pulses steady, rhythmic thrum against her ribs. She could still see him in the back of her mind, the stark, carved beauty of the king of the dead, a man whose realm she had invaded with the precision of a master thief. She had taken his trust, dismantled his composure, and stolen his most potent secrets. But the high had curdled. With the path to his domain now too treacherous to tread, she was left with the hollow ache of the hunt. She knew they were watching. She could feel the static of the nymph's surveillance humming through the thin walls of her room. They were like small, frantic moths circling a flame they could not understand. She didn't mind. Let them watch. Let them think she was merely restless. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass, her reflection staring back with eyes that were far older than the girl they were meant to represent. The game had changed. The pieces were no longer on the board. The board itself was burning. And as she drifted into a sleep that offered no comfort, she knew that somewhere in the dark, the master of the abyss was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his own undoing. The nymphs were merely shadows in her periphery, their vigilance a dull, buzzing annoyance she had long since learned to ignore. Locked behind her chamber door, Persephone was a universe unto herself, governed by a secret architecture of defiance. The cap of invisibility lay in her hands like a cold, metal promise, a sliver of the abyss that granted her the power of a ghost. She was no longer a prisoner of her mother's island. She was a predator on the prowl. She kissed the helm, the metal tasting of iron and anticipation. The thoughts of the king, his shadowed, sovereign presence, flickered in her mind like a candle flame in a draught, but she pushed them aside. For now, the game was about the thrill of the hunt, the seductive taste of absolute freedom. She waited for the dark. When the moon finally surrendered to the heavy, velvet shroud of Nyx, Persephone slipped through the back door. The forest was not the sanctuary she knew by daylight. Stripped of the sun, the woods had mutated into a labyrinth of skeletal limbs and grasping shadows. The wind, usually a companion, now sounded like a mockery of her own hubris, whistling through the branches with a jagged, sneering rhythm. Then she saw it, a single narcissus, pale and spectral, glowing in the sticky blackness of the forest floor. Her favorite flower. It felt like an invitation, a lure cast into the dark. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the soft, wilting petals. Then, a few paces ahead, another, and another. A trail, stitched into the earth like a breadcrumb path leading straight into the gullet of the forest. The air grew heavy, curdling with a scent that was not of the island. It was the smell of damp earth, of things buried, and of a power that made the marrow in her bones vibrate. She found herself drifting deeper into the thicket, the path vanishing behind her as if the forest were closing its mouth. She stood in a clearing where the trees stood like gaunt sentinels, their branches clawing at the starless void. Her heart, which had danced with the thrill of her own cleverness, now hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. The silence was absolute, save for the dry, scraping sound of the wind through the dead leaves. "Is someone there?" she breathed, the sound swallowed instantly by the trees. Silence answered. But the air around her was wrong, displaced, heavy, and pressurized by a presence that refused to remain hidden. She turned, the bunch of narcissuses clutched in her hand like a funeral bouquet, ready to bolt toward the safety of the main path. But the forest had other plans. A hand materialized from the dark. It did not reach out. It emerged with the finality of a closing trap. It clamped around her arm, a grip of immovable, crushing force, feeling less like flesh and more like the unyielding jaws of a beast. She opened her mouth to scream, a primal, terrified sound meant to shatter the silence, but the air died in her throat. Before the sound could break the stillness, a shadow enveloped her, cold and absolute, and the forest swallowed her whole. The night air, once cool and inviting, curdled into something suffocating. The forest floor was no longer dirt and leaf litter. It was a stage for a confrontation that had been years in the making. The cap of invisibility, that prize of absolute silence and shadow, lay discarded in the tall grass, a useless trinket now that the hunter had closed the distance. Persephone's world had been compressed into a sensory nightmare. The scent of damp earth, the coarse fabric of a blindfold biting into her skin, and the crushing, possessive weight of the man who had reclaimed his own. She was held in a grip that felt like the gears of an ancient mechanism, relentless and immovable. Every frantic, instinctive thrash of her body against his iron-like hold was met with an even tighter, more calculated suppression. There was no escape in this pocket of the world. Her mother's warnings, those desperate, terrifying monologues about the predators of the earth, now played out in the marrow of her bones. The sanctuary was breached. The predator was not only inside the gates, he was beneath her skin. Then he spoke. The voice was a low, velvet vibration against the shell of her ear, a sound that held the weight of centuries and the sharp edge of a blade. It was a question, though it functioned as a sentence. He didn't just touch her, he claimed her, his movements stripped of the tender masks he had worn in the underworld. Here, in the dark, stripped of her disguises, she was simply the girl who had played with the gods and lost. As his presence surged against her, a tide of heat and raw, unabashed intent, her body responded with a traitorous, involuntary ache. The physical reality of him was an intrusion, a violent reminder that for all her cleverness and all her schemes, she was still a creature of flesh, vulnerable to his gravity. The pain of their collision was a sharp, white-hot line drawn through the dark, but it was quickly drowned out by a sensation that was far more dangerous. It was the feeling of being known. Hades moved with a predatory focus, his hands mapping the landscape of her defiance, forcing her to confront the reality of her own deception. He was the king of the final, cold silence, and he had come to collect on the promises she had sworn by the river of oaths. She had wanted to be a goddess of her own destiny, but as he forced the rhythm of their encounter, she felt the horrifying, delicious collapse of that autonomy. He didn't want apologies. He wanted to understand the alchemy of her lies. The mockery in his tone, the way he ground the name of the underworld into the fabric of her reality, left her breathless. She had spent her life dreaming of a world beyond the island, a world of great adventures and infinite horizons, and now she was drowning in the depth of the one she had unwittingly summoned. She clung to him, not out of affection, but out of a primal need to keep from shattering under the intensity of his retribution. She had reached for the shadows, hoping to master them, but she had only succeeded in being consumed. The forest watched in silence as the boundary between punishment and passion disintegrated. He was the end of all things, the finality she had courted, and as he drove her to the brink of her own endurance, the truth of her predicament finally settled over her. She was no longer a player in the game. She was the prize. And in the dark, she realized with a shudder that she had never been more alive. The forest floor was a theater of agony and unraveling. Persephone, the girl who had woven a tapestry of lies so intricate it had ensnared a god, now found herself the prisoner of her own design. Every movement was a tremor, every breath a jagged protest against the weight of the king who pinned her to the earth. Hades, the master of the silent, final realm, was no longer the composed judge of the dead. He was a vessel for a storm he had spent eons suppressing. He loathed himself for it. He loathed that a single mortal, or a goddess cloaked in mortal skin, had the power to turn his cold, rhythmic heart into a frantic, chaotic mess. Each thrust was an indictment, a rhythmic, punishing question. How could he have been so easily dismantled? The echoes of the world above, the frantic, whispered warnings of Hermes, played in the back of his mind like a recurring, discordant melody. He had been the puppet of a child, a fool who had traded his divine detachment for the warmth of a lie. The name Persephone tasted like iron in his mouth, a secret he had been forced to learn through the violent friction of her betrayal. He didn't want the truth of her parentage, nor the politics of her mother's gilded island. He wanted only to excise the rot of the deceit that had bloomed within him. He thought of the oath, that binding, suffocating promise she had extracted from him under the guise of love. It was a noose of his own making, and now, as he possessed her, he realized it was a noose that would never loosen. Persephone had ceased her struggle. The fight had drained from her, replaced by a raw, overwhelming surrender that fed the fire already consuming him. Her fingers, once seeking escape, now traced the lines of his exhaustion, a sensory betrayal that made Hades burn with an even sharper, more destructive ire. He was not merely claiming her, he was reclaiming his own sanity, piece by broken piece. He had expected her to be a nymph, a fleeting spark of life in the gray expanse of his underworld. Instead, he had found a creature who had navigated the labyrinth of his dominion with the cold, calculated precision of an executioner. The face that had once looked up at him with such soft, feigned innocence was now the face of his own undoing. He knew now that her tears had been currency, her jealousy a practiced mask, and her oath a tactical strike against the very foundations of his authority. The girl was gone. In her place was a stranger, bound by destiny and spite, forever tethered to the man who was meant to be the end of all paths. As he drove himself into her, a primal, relentless rhythm that ignored her whimpers, he understood that he no longer cared for the consequences of his wrath. If she had come for his secrets, he would leave his mark so deep that no garden, no mother's protection, and no divine law would ever be able to wash it away. She had wanted to play with the king of the dead. She was about to learn that he did not play by the rules of the living. The forest grew unnervingly quiet, save for the sound of their collision and the jagged breaths that signaled the final bridge between their two worlds. The trail of narcissuses, those pale, deceptive blossoms, lay crushed beneath them, a silent testimony to the trap that had finally sprung. The descent had been long, and the climb back to grace was now entirely impossible. The forest had become a crucible of raw, unfiltered desperation. Here, beneath the canopy of ancient trees that held their breath in the presence of a god, the lines between obsession and devotion had completely dissolved. Hades, a sovereign who had once governed through the cold weight of silence and eternal judgment, was now a creature of feverish motion, driven by a need to punish and a need to possess. His movements were no longer the measured strides of an immortal. They were the frantic, rhythmic demands of a man trying to exorcise a ghost from his own blood. Persephone, the girl who had traded her innocence for a crown of lies, writhed beneath him, her body a battlefield where trauma and desire clashed in the dark. She was the architect of his unraveling, yet as his hands claimed her, hard, possessive, and inescapable, the reality of their union felt like the only truth left in a world built on artifice. He bit her skin, a mark of ownership that tasted of salt and desperation. Every time he pulled back, only to drive deeper into the heat of her, he felt the fraying of his own composure. He wanted to despise her. He wanted the ice in his heart to freeze the fire he felt blooming between them, but her pleas, that broken, high-pitched music of surrender, pulled him deeper into the abyss. When she gasped, questioning his fidelity, the absurdity of the moment struck him like a blow. She, the liar, the infiltrator, the daughter of a goddess who had turned his life into a cage, dared to demand loyalty. He didn't answer. He simply moved with a ferocity that defied the silence of the woods. He was losing his footing in the storm, and as he watched her eyes glaze over, he wondered if the oath that bound them was a blessing or a curse. Was she a predator, or was she simply the mirror reflecting the darkness he had tried so hard to deny? In the distance, past the reach of his fury, the island was not as quiet as he assumed. Cyane, a nymph with eyes like polished amber and a mind sharpened by suspicion, was closing the distance. She moved through the undergrowth with the grace of a shadow, her ears tuned to the unnatural rhythm of the night. She didn't believe the facade of the peaceful room. She didn't believe the tales of the girl who had simply vanished into the sea. She had trailed the scent of a secret, following the path of torn fingers and bruised intentions until the land itself gave way to the hungry mouth of the cliffside. The air grew colder here, tasting of salt and ancient depths. As she pressed herself against the wet, jagged stone, she found it, the cave. It was a jagged wound in the side of the earth, low and flooded with the rhythmic, mournful pulse of the tide. Cyane hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what she would find in the dark, and she knew that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Inside the cavern, the water rippled, disturbed by a presence that did not belong to the island. Cyane reached out a hand, her fingertips grazing the damp rock, her breath hitched in her throat. She was inches away from the truth, standing on the threshold of a revelation that threatened to burn the world above to ash. The waves crashed against the cliff, a thunderous applause for the tragedy unfolding just beyond her sight. Cyane leaned forward, the darkness beckoning her into the void, completely unaware that she was about to witness a god at his most vulnerable and most dangerous. The coastline was a jagged wound against the island's serenity, and the cave, a low, weeping aperture in the cliffside, was a secret the earth had tried to bury. Cyane stood before it, her senses reeling. The air here didn't smell of the sea. It carried the metallic, ozone tang of a brewing storm and the impossible scent of something scorched. Then she saw them. 6 horses, their manes flickering with flames of obsidian fire, tethered to a carriage that looked like a chariot forged from frozen shadows. They were creatures of nightmare, pulsing with an unnatural, rhythmic stillness. The sight should have driven her to flight, but her feet were anchored in the frozen soil of her own dread. Then, the silence of the night was shattered. It wasn't a sound of distress in the way she expected. It was the raw, guttural cadence of a collision between divinity and desire. She heard names that were forbidden, voices that belonged to the architect of the dead, and the unmistakable, frantic rhythm of a girl losing herself in the arms of a monster. Cyane did not witness the act, but she felt its aftershocks. The air grew heavy, pregnant with a pressure that squeezed the breath from her lungs. She stumbled back, crawling through the grit and the sharp, unforgiving stone, her mind fracturing under the weight of what she had overheard. It was a symphony of possession, a chaotic blend of threats and yearnings that stained the darkness. By the time the black chariot dissolved into the pre-dawn mist, Cyane was a shell, her face the color of wet ash. When the dawn finally broke, the island returned to its domestic routine, blissfully ignorant of the tectonic shift that had occurred in the dark. The nymphs were a frantic hive, buzzing with the missing presence of their charge. Cyane, you were on watch. Where is she? The question was a pinprick, but Cyane felt it like a lance. She looked at her companions, but she didn't see them. She saw the flickers of flame, the cold grip of the abyss, and the way the shadows had clung to Persephone like a lover's shroud. She pushed past them, her movements mechanical, driven by a morbid, unstoppable compulsion. She returned to the cave. It was deeper than it had appeared. The entrance was a narrow throat that led into a cavernous lung of stone. She entered, her lantern a flickering, pathetic spark against a darkness that seemed to have its own weight. She reached the chamber, a dead end where the ceiling soared into the damp, lightless heights. She held her lantern up, and the light revealed a madness that stopped her heart. The walls were not stone. They were a canvas of frantic, overlapping obsession. Scratched deep into the rock were words, hundreds of them, carved by desperate, bleeding fingers. They were not prayers, they were mantras. They were promises of violence, oaths of ownership, and disjointed, feverish fragments of a mind that had been cracked open. I am yours.
Kill her.
It hurts. I am waiting. Scattered on the floor, like discarded porcelain, were the broken shards of fingernails, torn away in the fervor of creation. The lantern slipped from Cyane's trembling hand, shattering against the stone. The light died, but the words seemed to burn in the blackness, glowing with a residual, psychic heat. Cyane stood in the absolute dark, realization dawning on her like a slow, crushing weight. The girl who had vanished had not been taken. She had been erased, replaced by something that belonged to the king of the dead. And as the echoes of those scratched words filled the cavern, she realized with a jolt of pure, icy terror that she was no longer alone in the cave. The cavern was a hollow ribcage of stone, oppressive and ancient, where the only light bled from the pomegranate held in Hades' grip. His fingers, corded with tension, dug into the fruit until the rind ruptured. It did not merely split. It surrendered, weeping viscous, crimson nectar that slicked his skin like fresh blood. Persephone watched the juice track down his forearm, a dark, rhythmic stain that seemed to mark the passage of time, or perhaps the finality of an ending. He offered the fruit as a command, not a choice. The air between them was static, thick with the scent of crushed seeds and the metallic tang of an oath about to be rewritten. Persephone's defiance was a fragile, paper-thin thing, fluttering in the shadow of a power that had no name. She spoke of her mother, of the suffocating, holy tether of her upbringing, but her words were hollow echoes against the cave's unyielding walls. Hades was not interested in the architecture of her loyalty. He was an inevitability. When he forced her lips apart, the sweetness was violent. It was the taste of forbidden sunlight and stolen earth, an intoxication that surged through her senses like a fever. As the seeds burst against her tongue, she felt the anchor of her past drag across the floor of her soul, snapping one by one. The betrayal was complete. The key to her prison was no longer in her hand. It was dissolving in her blood. She remembered the beginning, the whispers that had guided her like a phantom limb. Before the island, before the cage of her mother's affection, there had only been the curiosity, the itch to see what lay beneath the skin of the world. She had stood on the banks of the Acheron, a living, breathing anomaly among the husks of the departed. The dead had sneered at her, their voices a discordant chorus of disdain, calling her a doll of straw, a creature of fleeting light. And then their eyes had met. Hades. The name had been a weight, a heavy, velvet cloak that settled over her shoulders. In the gray, infinite expanse of his gaze, she had seen not the horror of death, but the absolute, terrifying freedom of it. The whispers in her mind, those parasitic, intoxicating voices, had shrieked in recognition. They had promised her that he was the lever capable of prying her out of the world's grip. She realized then that her devotion to her mother had been a slow-motion suicide, a performance of affection that starved her own spirit. The oath on the sticks, that pathetic, trembling plea for a love that would never truly belong to her, was a mistake she had corrected the moment she saw him. She felt the cold, creeping inevitability of it all. It was not a choice. It was the unfolding of a map drawn at the dawn of time. She looked at her own red-stained fingertips, the color of the fruit and the color of the retribution she now craved. Her mother's world was fading, replaced by the dark, opulent weight of the king's domain. She had tried to bargain with destiny, only to realize that she was never the player, but the piece being moved across the board. A faint, jagged smile ghosted over her lips. The hatred she had nurtured for her mother was no longer a burden, it was a compass. If death was the price of her liberation, she would pay it in full. She leaned into the dark, accepting the irreversible, intoxicating stain of the pomegranate. Fate had finally found its target, and in the oppressive silence of the cave, she realized with a shudder that she had never been more free, nor more utterly destroyed. The underworld is not merely a place, it is a psychological pressure cooker, a realm where the air tastes of ancient dust and forgotten breath. It was here, in the suffocating shadows, that the daughter of Demeter walked, not as a victim, but as a predator cloaked in the soft, deceptive silk of innocence. Sisyphos, the architect of his own endless torment and a man who had stared into the abyss long enough to recognize a fellow monster, watched her. She had come to him, the supposed mastermind of human cunning, with a request that chilled his very core. She did not want to be saved, and she certainly did not want to be free. She wanted to construct a cage, and she wanted Hades to be the one who locked the door. Her logic was a jagged, beautiful distortion. She spoke of love as if it were a tactical maneuver, a way to replace one suffocating devotion, her mother's, with another, far more dangerous obsession. She did not crave tenderness, she craved a ruinous, singular focus. She wanted the king of the dead to be hollowed out by his need for her, to be so consumed by his desire that he would forget the very concept of anyone else. She offered Sisyphos a bargain soaked in blood. She demanded he shoulder the burden of her sins, the betrayals, the violence, the absolute, cold-blooded erasure of those who stood in her way. She wasn't asking for help. She was assigning a role in her play, and the penalty for refusal was erasure. He watched the light in her eyes. It wasn't the glow of divinity. It was the iridescent shimmer of allure, a flicker designed to draw the unwary into the depths. She was sick of mercy, sick of the tepid, suffocating love of her mother, and she had decided that if she were to be owned, it would be by a god whose touch could turn the world to ash. She moved through the underworld with an unsettling ease, treating the domain of the final silence as her own personal sandbox. Sisyphos, a man who had famously cheated death, found himself trembling in her presence. He realized then that gods were not governed by the same moral geography as humans. They were forces of nature, and she was a storm masquerading as a breeze. She didn't want Hades to look at her with affection. She wanted him to look at her with the frantic, unblinking hunger of a man who has lost his mind. She wanted the obsession to be total. She wanted the monopoly of his attention, the absolute destruction of his indifference. As she laid out the final pieces of her design, her smile was a blade, keen, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. She was playing a game of shadows where the prize was a soul, and the stakes were the order of the universe itself. Sisyphos agreed, his own ambitions tethered to the promise of his own release from the monotony of the grave. But even as he made his pact, a cold realization settled in his gut. He had just handed the keys to the kingdom to a girl who was perfectly happy to burn it down. And so, the secret remained, buried deep in the gloom of the underworld, whispered only in the spaces between heartbeats. The world above continued on, unaware that the king of the dead had been ensnared by a girl who played at being a daughter while nursing the ambition of a demon. The stage is set, the oath is sworn, and somewhere in the dark, the god who holds the power to crush empires is unknowingly dancing to the rhythm of a girl who has decided that if she is to be chained, she will be the one holding the leash. The surface world had withered into a colorless husk. Demeter, the goddess of golden harvests, had turned her grief into a famine that scoured the earth, a frantic, desperate searching that left the fields silent and the people starving. Her rage was a tectonic force, and yet it was a soundless scream compared to the absolute, suffocating victory unfolding beneath the crust of the earth. In the underworld, the air did not carry the scent of rot, but the cold, ozone sharpness of a domain reordered. Persephone stood on the fog-drenched banks of the Acheron, the black river churning with the weight of uncounted souls. Charon, the ferryman, looked at her with a mix of genuine confusion and begrudging deference. He expected a captive, a trembling blossom plucked from the sun. He found instead a girl who wore the shadows like a crown. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was waiting for the final act of her transformation. When Hermes arrived, his celestial radiance was jarring against the absolute, velvet dark of the underworld. He brought with him the frantic, discordant noise of Olympus, the rumors of kidnapping, the political maneuvers of Zeus, and the agonizing, pathological grief of a mother who refused to let go. He spoke of the pomegranate, that cursed fruit of finality, with the tone of a man trying to fix a shattered vase. Persephone listened, her face a carefully curated mask of soft, sorrowful innocence. It was a masterpiece of deception. She played the part of the daughter, trapped, naive, and tragically misled, so convincingly that even the messenger of the gods began to falter in his accusations. She spun a narrative of a life lived in a gilded cage, feigning ignorance of the price she had paid when the seeds of the underworld burst against her tongue. And then she offered the solution. A compromise. 6 months in the light, 6 months in the dark. A rhythmic cycle of life and death, an arrangement that looked like mercy but functioned as an anchor. Hermes left, his mind clouded by her subtle manipulation. He thought he was delivering a verdict. He was merely delivering her terms. Persephone watched his retreating form, a small, solitary figure against the expanse of the dead. She knelt by the black, churning water of the Acheron and submerged her hands. The liquid cold bit into her skin, staining her pale fingers with the abyss, a stark contrast that felt less like a defilement and more like an initiation. She was no longer the daughter who hid in the tall grass, waiting for a permission to exist. She was the architect of her own duality. By dividing her time, she was ensuring that no realm could ever truly claim her, and no love, not even her mother's suffocating, desperate affection, could ever fully possess her again. A dark, wry thought brushed the edges of her mind. She would return to the sun, yes. She would play the role of the tragic maiden, the victim of a dark god's whim. She would bring the spring and summer back to a dying world, ensuring that her mother's devotion remained hers to exploit. And when the time came, she would descend back into the silence of the king's palace, where the shadows did not demand she be anything other than what she had chosen to become. The river hissed against the shore, the sound like 1,000 whispered secrets. She stood, the black water dripping from her fingers, a queen who had traded a garden for an empire. She had not been stolen. She had claimed her throne, and in doing so, she had become the only thing her mother could never hope to control. She looked toward the palace in the distance, where the king of the dead waited, a silent, sovereign shadow. She was ready. The trap was sprung, the bargain was sealed, and the cycle of the world was now beating in time with her own pulse. The underworld does not keep time, but it keeps count of longings. In the silent, shadowed chambers of the palace, the fog pressed against the windows like a living creature, hungry and unblinking. Persephone stood amidst the relics of a dark empire, daggers that had tasted Titan blood and a cap of shadows that could erase a soul from existence. They were merely ornaments now, cold steel and silk compared to the living, breathing reality of the man who stepped into the room. Hades, the king of the dead, a sovereign whose beauty was as sharp and unforgiving as the abyss he ruled. He leaned against the doorframe, a statue of obsidian and muscle, his gaze fixed on her with the kind of intensity that threatened to unmake the very foundations of the room. He was disgruntled, a storm trapped in human form, anchored by a hunger he refused to conceal. The cycle had come around again. The decree of the gods demanded her return to the sunlit world for half the year, a compromise that felt less like a peace treaty and more like a sentence of slow starvation for them both. Hades loathed the departure. He was a god who possessed everything, the gold, the souls, the endless expanse of the earth's roots, and yet he was haunted by the one thing he could not entirely command, her absence. Persephone approached him, her movements fluid and deliberate, the contrast of her porcelain skin against his dark, heavy robes a visual dissonance that set the air humming. She did not fear his frustration. She nurtured it. She knew the power of the leash she had woven around his heart. When he kissed her, it was an eviction of all restraint. It was not a gesture of tenderness, but a deep, invasive reclamation. His tongue was a serpent, exploring, claiming, and digging into the quiet spaces of her resolve. He wasn't just kissing her, he was verifying her existence, binding her to him with a physical intensity that blurred the lines between devotion and destruction. The air in the chamber grew thick with the scent of crushed daffodils and the copper tang of rising desire. With a single, savage motion, Hades cleared the table. Vases shattered, a cacophony of ceramic shards punctuating the sudden silence as he pulled her into the wreckage. The mundane tools of his reign, the quills and the records of the dead, were discarded for something far more primal. He moved with a desperate, self-flagellating obsession, treating her body as the only map that mattered in a kingdom of ghosts. He was a man who had reached his own limits, a god who had realized that his throne was a hollow thing compared to the heat of the woman beneath him. He was tired of the game, tired of the half-measures of heaven and earth. His touch was both a caress and a claim, his hands molding her with the strength of a king who knew he was being dismantled by his own needs. As he breached the threshold of her body, his eyes, dark and turbulent, reflected a soul that had long since stopped looking for a way out. She was his gravity, his tether, and his undoing. And as the echoes of their union shivered through the dark, ancient palace, the silence of the underworld deepened, indifferent to the world above, perfectly content to witness the king of the dead fall to his knees, utterly defeated by the only secret he could never solve. The chamber was a cathedral of shadows, where the only rhythm that mattered was the frantic, discordant pulse of two souls colliding in the dark. It was a union that defied the quiet dignity of the afterlife, a collision of hunger and desperation that left the very air shimmering with a feverish, electric tension. Hades moved with the unrestrained force of a man who had waited an eternity to claim what was his every movement a testament to the suffocating agony of their impending separation. Persephone was no longer merely a passenger in this storm. She met his intensity with a yearning that burned as bright as his own, her skin slick with the exertion of their dance. She was a landscape being mapped, a kingdom being conquered again and again, as Hades navigated the depths of her body with the possessive authority of a king. There was no mercy in his rhythm, only the brutal, honest truth of his need. The room seemed to shrink around them, the rattling of the furniture a frantic beat to the song of their bodies. For the king of the dead, there was no return to the composure that defined his rule. He had been hollowed out, filled instead with the intoxicating, dangerous obsession that she alone had sparked. He was a beast in a cage of his own making, and she was the only one who held the key. Just as the threshold of ecstasy neared, a point where breath turned to ragged pleas and the world narrowed down to the friction of their skin, a sound shattered the sanctuary. Knock, knock. The intrusion was like a blade of ice. The rhythm of their dance stuttered, then stalled. The voice of Hermes, crisp and inconvenient, drifted through the heavy oak. He brought with him the complications of the living, the arrival of Orpheus, the expectations of the gods, and the encroaching reality of the surface world. Hades froze, his muscles coiled like a spring held in check. Below him, Persephone clung to him, her eyes wide, her body still humming with the residual heat of their collision. The contrast was almost cruel. The messenger of the heavens stood waiting, oblivious to the fact that he was standing on the threshold of a god's unraveling. With a final, lingering pressure, Hades pulled back. The transition was jarring, a return to the chilling, sovereign cold he wore like armor. He did not look like a man who had just been shattered. He looked like the king once more, though the slight, dangerous flush at the tips of his ears betrayed the fire he had barely suppressed. He left her then, retreating into the shadow of his duty. Persephone sat in the sudden, ringing silence, the physical ache of his absence sharp and hollow. The heat that had consumed her began to cool, replaced by the damp, metallic chill of the underworld. She was left alone with the wreckage of their moment. The scattered robes, the shattered vase, and the lingering, phantom sensation of his hands. She was the queen of the dead, and yet, in this moment, she felt the weight of her crown. Her departure to the world of light was hours away, a return to the mother who expected the return of her perfect daughter. She looked toward the door, where the god of death had vanished to attend to his grim, unending tasks. She stood, adjusting the fabric of her gown, her movements graceful and composed. The disappointment was a cold stone in her stomach, but she swallowed it down. If he was to be the king who ruled the silence, then she would be the queen who orchestrated the noise. She took a breath, the air of the underworld filling her lungs, dark, heavy, and eternally waiting. The world above was a dream, but here, in the cold, unyielding shadows, she was finally home. She turned away from the door, a faint, cryptic smile touching her lips, unaware that the arrival of the musician Orpheus was about to tip the scales of her carefully constructed fate into an abyss no one could have anticipated. The palace of the underworld was a place where light went to die, yet here stood Orpheus, a man woven from melody and grief, whose very presence felt like a discordant intrusion. His features were delicate, his expression etched with a desperate, sharp-edged hope that usually ended in madness. He came clutching a lyre, an instrument rumored to coax tears from the very stones of the earth, seeking to bargain with the one force that never bartered, death. Persephone observed him from the shadows of her throne. She was no longer the girl who had been whispered to by the phantom voices of her own mind. She was the queen, cool and detached, watching the drama of mortality play out like a familiar, tired script. She had heard the pleas of the bereaved before, the desperate, clawing prayers of those who thought love was a currency that could purchase a soul back from the dark. Usually, these requests were met with the impenetrable, glacial silence of the king. Yet, Persephone felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest, not for the poet, but for the reflection of her own tangled reality. She looked at Hades, the dark titan who held her heart in a grip that was as possessive as it was devastating, and then back at the lovers. Orpheus began to play. The music was a crystalline lament, a sound so profoundly beautiful it turned the very atmosphere of the hall into a shroud of melancholy. Even Hades, usually unmoved by the frantic heartbeat of the living, seemed to tilt his head, the rigid lines of his face softening into a reluctant, brooding contemplation. He gestured, a silent command that sent a servant into the abyss to retrieve a ghost. Eurydice emerged from the gloom, her spirit as pale and fragile as a moth. When she saw Orpheus, the reunion was a violent eruption of tears and desperate embraces. It was a scene of such raw, agonizing beauty that it felt almost obscene against the backdrop of the eternal gray. Persephone leaned close to Hades, her hand finding his. Her skin was a stark contrast to his dark, obsidian-cool touch. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thrum of his heart, a sound she had recently known so intimately. The weight of their own situation pressed down on them. Hades had descended to claim her, to trap her, to make her his own. Orpheus had descended to release his love, to steal her back from the grasp of the void. They were mirrored fates, and the irony was a bitter, metallic taste on Persephone's tongue. She whispered to her husband, her voice a soft, velvet blade. She didn't want the poet to fail. She didn't want the music to stop. In this strange act of altruism, she was testing the boundaries of Hades' devotion. If he granted this, if he bent the unyielding law of the dead, it would be a testament not to his mercy, but to his love for her. Hades remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ghost of Eurydice, his thumb brushing against Persephone's wrist with a contemplative, lingering pressure. He was a god of ironclad rules, and yet, the woman beside him was his only exception. The lovers held their breath, their hands clasped in a silent prayer, looking up at the two monarchs of the dark with eyes full of a terrifying, fleeting light. Persephone squeezed Hades' hand, her touch a silent demand, a plea that bridged the gap between their two worlds. Hades' jaw tightened. He looked at the poet, then at the queen who had hijacked his cold, dead world and turned it into something dangerously alive. The air in the throne room grew thin, charged with the crackle of a decision that would ripple through time. The king of the dead looked down at his own hand, the hand that held the power to snuff out stars, and for a heartbeat, the absolute darkness of his eyes betrayed a flicker of something profoundly human. He was silent, but in that silence, Persephone heard the crushing weight of the bargain he was about to make. The cost of grace in the underworld was never paid in gold, it was always paid in blood and shadows. And as he began to turn his head toward the lovers, she knew that whatever he decided, the consequences would be a debt they would all have to pay. The decree had been spoken, and the air in the palace grew heavy with the weight of an impossible bargain. Persephone's plea, a calculated bridge between her own longing and the poet's desperation, had shifted the very gravity of the underworld. Hades had relented, not out of sudden altruism, but because he saw in Orpheus a reflection of the fire that burned within himself. He granted them the path to the living, bound by a condition that was as cruel as it was simple: faith, in its purest, most untested form. One look, one glance of doubt, and the bargain would shatter like glass. Hermes, ever the observer, watched with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. He saw the shift in Persephone, a bloom of dark authority that was both fascinating and unsettling. She was no longer just the abducted girl. She was the architect of destiny, a queen who played with human lives to satisfy her own complex understanding of love. As Hades turned away, his stride sharp and unyielding, Hermes trailed behind, his mind already spinning with the odds of their failure. He was a gambler by nature, and he knew that human faith was a brittle thing, easily snapped by the whisper of uncertainty. The climb was an agonizing exercise in absence. Orpheus, his lyre heavy on his back, led the way, his heart a frantic metronome. The path back to the sun was not merely distance, it was a psychological gauntlet. He heard the rhythm of his own feet, the measured tread of the god leading them, but behind him, there was nothing but a void. Silence. The lack of sound became a deafening roar. Eurydice was there. He had to believe she was there, but she was a shadow, a presence he could not feel, hear, or touch. The darkness of the underworld, usually so indifferent, now felt malicious, stretching out to obscure the truth. Every step forward was a choice, a violent pull against the natural instinct to look back and verify the reality of the woman who held his soul. He spoke, his voice cracking against the damp stone, but the only response was the dry, clipped tone of the messenger god, warning him to hold his tongue. The doubt began as a flicker, a small, cold spark of terror. What if she had stumbled? What if the mist had swallowed her, leaving him to walk toward a sunlight that would only illuminate his own loneliness? The silence of his wife, the woman who had once sung with him, was now a jagged blade pressed against his spine. He imagined her feet, delicate and pale, bruising against the sharp, uncaring rock of the subterranean path. He imagined her eyes, perhaps clouded with the confusion of the dead, struggling to find him in the gloom. The distance to the exit became an eternity. With every step, the psychological tension coiled tighter, a spring reaching its breaking point. He was climbing toward life, but the fear of a lonely resurrection was clawing at his throat. Then, the aperture of the exit appeared, a tiny, piercing star of reality in the absolute dark. It promised the world, the wind, and the warmth of the sun, but it also promised the finality of a test. Orpheus stopped. His body locked, his muscles screaming with the urge to spin around and burn the world to ashes just to see her face one last time. He stood on the precipice of salvation, his spirit teetering on the edge of an abyss. The exit was right there, a mere few steps away. And yet, the silence behind him felt final. He gripped his lyre until his knuckles went white, his breath hitching in his chest. The silence was no longer empty. It was screaming at him, daring him to doubt, daring him to turn. And just as the first glimmer of true daylight hit his face, the weight of the unknown became too much to bear. The cavern exhaled, a long, shivering release of air that signaled the finality of a bargain broken. Orpheus stood at the threshold of the sun, his hands clutching at empty space, his fingers brushing only the cold, uncaring dust of the exit. Behind him, the darkness did not just remain, it reclaimed. He had looked. In that single, fracturing heartbeat of doubt, he had traded his devotion for the visual proof of his wife's shadow, and the gods had laughed. Eurydice did not scream as she was pulled back into the abyss. She simply faded, a soft, final erasure that left Orpheus kneeling in the dirt, his sobs a discordant, ugly music that mocked his own legendary talent. Hermes, standing at the edge of the light, didn't offer a hand. He only watched, a cynical spectator to the predictable frailty of the human spirit. The bet was won, the tragedy was complete, and the glorious, uncaring morning light of the surface world felt like a physical assault. Back in the heart of the palace, the atmosphere was one of calculated serenity. Persephone sat before her vanity, the hum of distant music vibrating through the stone floors. It was the echo of the lyre, a lingering resonance of the performance she had requested, now serving as a requiem for a hope she had never truly believed in. She moved with a feline grace, her fingers tracing the sharp, cold edge of a blade, the object she had used to carve out her own narrative in this kingdom of ghosts. She cleaned the steel with a methodical, almost tender precision. The red stains that had marred the cloth were not merely artifacts of violence, they were the pigments of her freedom. On the table before her, a basket of pomegranates sat like a silent, crimson altar. She picked one up, inhaling its scent. It was the perfume of her captivity, and yet it was the only air she cared to breathe. She was no longer the girl who had feared the dark. She was the architect who had built her throne upon it. She cut the fruit, the rind parting with a soft, succulent resistance. The seeds inside were like clusters of rubies, wet and inviting, a perfect, bloody contrast to the pristine stillness of her room. She brought a piece to her lips, the tart, staining juice coating her tongue, a flavor she had come to associate with the only kind of love she understood, the kind that demands total ownership. The door swung open, the hinges groaning in the heavy, pressurized air of the underworld. Persephone did not jump. She did not hide the blade. She simply laid it aside, a silver sliver of intention against the dark wood of the table. She looked up, her expression a mask of exquisite, untroubled calm, to see a ghost she had long ago consigned to the mud. Ceres stood there, the goddess of the harvest, the mother who had turned the world into a graveyard in her desperate, suffocating search for a daughter who had never wanted to be found. The silence that stretched between them was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a hunting ground. Persephone set the pomegranate down, the red juice vivid and glistening on her fingers, and smiled. It was a smile that did not reach her eyes, a smile that carried the weight of everything she had sacrificed and everything she had stolen. The air in the room grew thin, charged with the static of a long-overdue confrontation. Persephone did not rise. She remained seated, the queen of the dead watching her mother approach, knowing that for the first time, The roles of victim and predator were not just blurred, they were completely, irrevocably reversed. The air in the chamber had turned stagnant, heavy with the cloying, metallic scent of half-ripened fruit and something sharper, something that didn't belong in a sanctuary. Ceres stood in the doorway, her presence a jagged disruption to the quietude Persephone had cultivated. The mother, once a goddess of life-giving harvest, now carried the weary, suspicious weight of one who had seen her daughter stolen, only to realize the theft was far more internal than she had ever feared. Their exchange was a dance of blades sheathed in silk. Ceres' gaze darted to the table, latching onto the crimson-stained cloth with a tremor of revulsion. She was searching for a ghost of the girl she had raised, but found only a stranger with eyes like polished obsidian. Persephone did not flinch. She leaned into the unease, a predator who found nourishment in the discomfort of others. She spoke of her upcoming departure to the surface with a casual, chilling grace, a performance of filial piety that masked the absolute, iron-willed possessiveness she now wore like a second skin. Ceres retreated. There was no victory in her gaze, only a dawning, paralyzed realization that the daughter she had sought was gone, replaced by a queen who had mastered the art of shadows. When Hades finally arrived, the atmosphere shifted from cold suspicion to an almost suffocating intensity. He was a god undone, a titan of the abyss reduced to a man vibrating with the frantic, discordant frequency of obsession. He searched her face, his hands trembling as he traced the line of her jaw, looking for the cracks in her resolve, the lies he knew she was capable of weaving. He was the king of the dead, and yet he was a beggar at the altar of her affection, terrified that every departure was a permanent erasure. She met his anxiety with a tender, practiced lie, wrapping him in the soft, suffocating embrace of her feigned devotion. She whispered promises of love that were sweet, circular, and utterly empty of the truth he craved. She was the anchor he thought he needed, yet she was the very tide pulling him under. His eyes fell to the table, to the bloody cloth and the split fruit. A moment of silence stretched between them, a fragile, hollow thing. She dismissed his suspicion with a brush of her lips, a kiss that tasted of pomegranate juice and calculated finality. She knew he would never truly know her, and that was the true genius of her design. Persephone looked past him, her thoughts drifting to the world above, to the father whose shadow loomed in the sky and the mother whose love had been a cage. She had found her true cradle here, in the dark, where the king of the dead was nothing more than a toy in the hands of a girl who had learned how to play God. She watched him from the shadows of her own choosing, a smile playing on her lips. The world above would wait. The seasons would turn. The cycle would continue. But for tonight, the king was hers, the queen was absolute, and the darkness was not a place to be feared, it was a weapon to be wielded. The door began to creak, a long, mournful sound as the night descended, whispering secrets into the heart of the palace. And in that final, breathless moment, the trap was not just sprung, it was sealed forever.